She handed him a check for $700 like she was tipping a valet. Victoria Ashford, CEO of a billion-dollar empire, didn't even look up from her phone when she said it. We're wheels up in 40 minutes. Whatever you found, it can wait. Ethan Mercer stood in the middle of that gleaming hangar holding a report that said otherwise. 43 pages of standard findings. And then page 47, the one that made his stomach drop. He set the report on the table in front of her. Read page 47 before you fly. She didn't. She never did. And that single decision nearly killed everyone on board. If this story already has your attention, hit that like button right now and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The Meridian Aviation private terminal sat on the eastern edge of Harlow Regional Airport, like a building that had never been told the word modest. All glass and polished concrete, with a climate-controlled hangar bay large enough to house 4 aircraft comfortably. At 6:15 in the morning, the main bay held only one, a Gulfstream G650ER, tail number N441VA, white with a thin gold stripe running the length of the fuselage. The kind of aircraft that cost somewhere north of $65 million and existed in a world where a $700 inspection fee could be described without irony as a nuisance charge. Ethan Mercer had been inside the terminal for 11 minutes before anyone acknowledged he was there. He didn't mind. He was used to it. Independent aircraft inspectors occupied a strange position in the private aviation world, necessary enough to be required by regulation, annoying enough to be treated like a mild inconvenience. He stood near the entrance with his inspection kit and his clipboard, watching the ground crew move around the Gulfstream with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this hundreds of times and didn't need to think about it anymore. That was, in his experience, exactly when mistakes happened. You, Mercer? He turned. A man in his mid-40s was crossing the floor toward him, moving with the slightly aggressive energy of someone who had too much to manage and resented that list growing. He wore a Meridian Aviation polo shirt and the particular expression of a person who had been awake since 4 in the morning and wasn't happy about it. That's me, Ethan said. Richard Hale, Flight Operations Director. He didn't offer his hand. We've got a tight window this morning, so I'll need you to move through your checklist efficiently. Ms. Ashford wants wheels up by 8. I work at whatever pace the inspection requires, Ethan said. Not combative, just a statement of fact. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. Right. Well, Rodriguez will walk you through. He's the lead tech on this aircraft. He pointed toward a man in coveralls near the tail section, then turned and walked away without further ceremony. Ethan picked up his kit and walked toward the Gulfstream. Carlos Rodriguez was 38 years old and had spent the last 9 years as a maintenance technician at Meridian Aviation. He was the kind of mechanic who kept a worn copy of the manufacturer's maintenance manual in his locker, not because anyone told him to, but because he'd read it so many times that certain passages felt like old friends. He shook Ethan's hand when he approached, and something in his eyes suggested he was relieved to see an outside inspector, a detail Ethan filed away without commenting on. Morning, Carlos said. She's been through her regular cycle. Last major inspection was 6 months ago. Pre-flight checks came back clean. Logbooks, Ethan said. Carlos hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, barely enough to notice. In the office. I'll get them for you. While he waited, Ethan started with what he could see, the exterior walk-around. He moved slowly and methodically the way he always did, which was the way his old instructor Frank Dubois had drilled into him 20 years ago during his first week of certification training. The aircraft will tell you what's wrong if you're willing to listen. Most people aren't patient enough to listen. He crouched near the main landing gear. The hydraulic lines ran clean. He checked the brake assemblies, the wheel well, the actuator housing, everything visually correct. He stood and moved to the engine nacelles. Both Rolls-Royce BR 725 engines showed no evidence of oil leakage, no visible cracks in the fan housing, no foreign object debris in the intakes. He made notes. The fuselage skin was pristine, no buckles, no rivet anomalies, no stress marks that didn't belong. The Gulfstream was, by every visible measure, exactly what it appeared to be, A beautifully maintained, extraordinarily expensive aircraft. Carlos returned with a stack of logbooks and maintenance records. Ethan thanked him and found a flat surface near the nose of the aircraft to start working through them. The first 30 pages of documentation were unremarkable. Routine entries, oil changes, tire replacements, a bird strike on the left engine inlet 8 months ago, documented, inspected, cleared, avionics calibration, cabin pressurization system check, all of it in order, all of it signed off by certified personnel. Ethan turned pages with a methodical patience that he'd been told, more than once, was either a professional virtue or a personal defect, depending on who was doing the observing. He found the entry on page 31. It was for hydraulic system maintenance performed 6 weeks ago, specifically work on the auxiliary hydraulic pressure valve assembly in the aft equipment bay. The valve was part of the backup system that controlled several flight-critical functions, including the ground spoilers and the thrust reversers. The entry noted that the valve had been removed for inspection after a technician reported intermittent pressure readings. It was listed as having been reinstalled and tested. It was signed by a technician whose certification number Ethan didn't immediately recognize. He kept reading. Pages 32 through 35 were standard. On page 36, there was a follow-up entry. A general systems pressure check performed 4 days after the valve work. The numbers recorded were within normal operating range. Ethan paused. The pressure readings were within range, yes, but they were at the low end of that range. Not flagged as problematic. Not incorrect by the letter of the maintenance standard, but low. He flipped back to page 31 and read the valve reinstallation entry again. There was a box at the bottom of the form for recording the torque specifications applied during reinstallation. The box was filled in, 47 foot-pounds, which was the correct specification for that component. But the torque seal sticker that was supposed to be applied to the fitting after final tightening, the small adhesive indicator that confirmed the fastener hadn't been disturbed after installation, was not referenced anywhere in the documentation. Ethan looked at the signature on the entry again. Then he closed the logbook and walked toward the aft equipment bay of the aircraft. Carlos was checking something on a tablet near the wing root when Ethan approached. "The hydraulic valve work from 6 weeks ago," Ethan said. "Who performed the reinstallation?" Carlos looked up. Something shifted in his face, a slight flattening of expression that wasn't quite neutrality. "That was subcontracted. We had 2 guys out that week. Hale approved bringing in external labor." "The certification number on the entry. I need to verify it's current." "I can pull that." "I'd also like to access the aft equipment bay," Ethan said. "I need to physically inspect the valve assembly." Carlos nodded, and Ethan thought he saw the man exhale something that might have been relief. The aft equipment bay was accessed through a panel in the lower rear fuselage. It was a cramped space, not unusually so for this class of aircraft, housing a collection of hydraulic components, electrical junction boxes, and environmental system equipment. Ethan worked his way in with a flashlight and his inspection mirror. He found the pressure valve assembly after about 90 seconds. He looked at it for a long time. The valve itself was correctly positioned. The hydraulic lines were connected at the proper ports. On a quick visual scan, nothing would have stood out as wrong. But Ethan worked close and slow. The torque seal, the small stripe of paint or adhesive applied across the joint between a fastener and its mating surface to indicate if it had been disturbed, was absent on the primary fitting. And on the secondary fitting, the one that mattered most for maintaining pressure integrity in the backup system, the orientation of the fitting was off by a degree or two from what the installation diagram specified. Not dramatically off, not the kind of wrong that would be immediately obvious to someone doing a standard check, but off. He got his mirror positioned and confirmed what he was seeing. The fitting was installed in the right location, with the right torque value listed in the paperwork. But the paperwork also showed no torque seal applied, and the physical fitting was, unless his 20 years of looking at these systems was failing him, oriented slightly incorrect for the directional flow requirements of this specific valve model. He backed out of the bay and stood beside the aircraft in the quiet of the hangar. He made his notes. Then he went to write his report. He was on page 43 when Richard Hale reappeared. Where are we? Richard asked, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. Nearly finished, Ethan said without looking up. Good. I need to brief you on the timeline. Ms. Ashford has a ground transportation connection in... Mr. Hale. Ethan looked up now. I've identified some items in the documentation and in a physical inspection of the hydraulic system that require clarification before this aircraft departs. The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds. What items? Richard's voice had dropped about half an octave. The auxiliary hydraulic pressure valve work from 6 weeks ago. There are documentation gaps and a physical discrepancy in the valve installation that I'd like a certified hydraulic engineer to review. That work was signed off. It was signed by a certification number I've asked Carlos to verify, and the physical installation has an anomaly I'm not comfortable with. Richard pushed off the wall. Ethan. Can I call you Ethan? This aircraft has flown 14 times since that maintenance was performed, without incident. I understand that. So whatever you're seeing is something I'm going to put in my report, Ethan said. He turned back to his clipboard, which I'll finish in about 15 minutes. Richard stared at him for a moment. Then he turned and left. Bad. Victoria Ashford arrived at the terminal at 7:22, accompanied by 2 assistants and a man in a suit who appeared to be a lawyer, given the briefcase and the practiced expression of someone paid to be alert in situations that bored everyone else. She was 51 years old, sharp-featured, impeccably dressed in a dark blazer and charcoal slacks, moving through the space with the compact certainty of someone who had not lost an argument in quite some time. Ethan had seen her photograph before. She was prominent enough in the business world that her face appeared occasionally in the industry publications he read, but photographs hadn't captured the specific quality of her attention when it landed on you. It was precise and brief and somehow communicated, very efficiently, that she had already assessed you and moved on. She spoke briefly with Richard near the aircraft. He watched Richard's posture change during that conversation, a subtle straightening, a slight increase in the rate at which he was nodding. Then she turned and walked toward where Ethan was finishing his report at a side table. Mr. Mercer, she said. Ms. Ashford. Richard tells me you've identified a concern. I've identified items that require review before departure, he said. I'm finishing the report now. She pulled out her phone, glanced at it briefly, put it away. We're on a tight schedule. What we need from you this morning is a green light. If there's a paperwork issue, Richard's team can address it after we land in Seattle. Ethan looked at her steadily. That's not how this works. Excuse me? My job isn't to provide a green light on a timeline, he said. My job is to provide an accurate assessment of the aircraft's airworthiness. If I identify concerns, they need to be addressed before departure. That's what the regulatory framework requires, and it's also more practically how people don't get hurt. Victoria Ashford studied him. The expression on her face wasn't quite irritation. It was something more controlled than that. An assessment. What is your fee for this inspection? She asked. He told her. $700, she repeated. The way she said it wasn't loud or theatrical. It was quiet, which was somehow worse. I'm about to close a business arrangement worth just under $1 billion, Mr. Mercer. You're charging me $700 for an inspection, and on the basis of some paperwork gap and a fitting that's a few degrees off, you're prepared to delay that arrangement. On the basis of a documentation discrepancy and a physical installation anomaly in the hydraulic system of an aircraft you intend to fly to altitude, Ethan said. Yes. She held his gaze for a moment, then she looked at the report on the table. Is that it? It will be when I finish writing it. She picked up the report and began to leaf through it with the brisk efficiency of someone who processed large amounts of paper as a matter of course. She moved through the first 20 pages quickly, the middle section more quickly still. She didn't reach page 47. She set the report back on the table and said, Richard will have his team look at the fitting before we taxi. If it's structurally sound, we depart on schedule. She turned toward her assistants. Ethan watched her walk away. Then he picked up a pen and finished writing. When the report was complete, he set it back on the table, open to page 47. He walked to where Victoria Ashford stood with her team near the aircraft. Ms. Ashford. She turned. Read page 47 before you fly, he said. Then he picked up his kit and walked toward the exit. He sat in his truck in the parking lot for a while after that, engine off, drinking from a thermos of coffee he'd made at 5 that morning. The coffee was bad. He'd had it sitting on the element too long before he left the house, and it had developed that particular bitterness that no amount of sugar was going to fix. He drank it anyway because he needed the caffeine, and because sometimes you drank the bad coffee because it was what you had. He thought about the valve fitting. His name was Ethan James Mercer, and he was 44 years old, and he had spent the last 11 years doing independent aircraft inspections after 12 years before that as a maintenance technician for a regional carrier. He had seen the full range of what the industry produced: the excellent and the careless, the meticulous and the dangerously negligent, the near misses that never made the news, and the incidents that did. He had grounded aircraft that looked perfect on paper. He had cleared aircraft that looked concerning on paper but checked out physically. He had, twice in 11 years, identified something that he was later told would likely have resulted in a serious incident. He didn't think about those 2 occasions as victories. He thought about them the way he thought about the bad coffee, as things that needed to be done correctly, and then put aside. He thought about the valve on the Gulfstream, at the low end of the normal pressure range. No torque seal documented, a fitting orientation that was close to correct but wasn't quite. Any one of those things, individually, might be explainable. The pressure reading could be an instrument variance. The missing torque seal documentation could be a clerical gap. The fitting orientation might be within acceptable tolerance, and his eye might be off after a long early morning. All 3 of them together was something else. He started the truck and pulled out of the lot. Daniel Brooks had been a commercial pilot for 23 years, the last 6 of them flying private for Meridian Aviation. He was 52, built like someone who had been a distance runner in his 20s and still moved with the unconscious efficiency of it, with gray hair that his wife had once described as distinguished and that he privately thought of as evidence of time passing. He had flown N441 VA 41 times. He knew the aircraft the way you knew things you'd spent serious time with, not just its specifications and procedures, but its particular character, the small tendencies and habits that didn't appear in any manual. He was in the cockpit, running through his pre-flight checklist when Carlos appeared at the door with the inspection report. "The outside guy's report," Carlos said. He held it out with a slightly careful quality, the way you handed someone something that had weight to it. Daniel took it. "Anything I should know?" Carlos paused. "Page 47. Then he turned and went back down the air stairs. Daniel looked at the cover page. Then he set the report on the co-pilot's seat and turned to page 47. He read it twice. His first read-through was fast. The initial scan of a person looking for the shape of a problem. His second was slower, careful, the read of someone who intended to understand what he was looking at. When he finished the second reading, he sat for a moment with the report in his lap. Then he got up, went down the air stairs, and looked for Carlos. He found him near the aft equipment bay. "Has the hydraulic engineer looked at this?" Daniel asked. Carlos glanced toward the terminal windows. Hale said a visual check before taxi was sufficient. "A visual check," Daniel said. "That's what he said." Daniel looked at the aircraft. He looked at the report in his hand. He looked back at the terminal, where through the glass he could see Victoria Ashford's assistant gesturing at something on a laptop. "Get me Hale," Daniel said. But Richard Hale came out to the hangar floor with the particular energy of a man who had already had this conversation twice this morning and was running low on patience for it. "Captain Brooks, we are 22 minutes from scheduled departure." "I understand that," Daniel said. He held up the report. "I need a hydraulic engineer on this valve before we move." The valve was checked. "A visual check isn't sufficient for what's described on page 47, Daniel said. "The fitting orientation concern and the missing torque documentation together indicate the possibility that the assembly wasn't correctly reinstalled. If that valve leaks under operating pressure, it won't. You can't know that without an engineer on it." Daniel's voice was level, not aggressive, just level. The tone of someone who wasn't going to be moved. "The aircraft has flown 14 times since the maintenance. I understand that. But 14 previous flights don't guarantee the 15th. The hydraulic system works until it doesn't, Richard. That's the nature of it." Hale looked at him for a long moment. "Ms. Ashford needs to be in Seattle by 2 o'clock. he said. Then you should call a hydraulic engineer right now, Daniel said, so we can get this done and get the aircraft cleared. Richard Hale pulled out his phone. The expression on his face had shifted into something harder to read. Not quite anger, not quite fear. Something occupying the space between them. He made a call. The engineer, a woman named Petra Hollis, who contracted with 3 private terminal operators across the region and had the dry, direct manner of someone who had spent 20 years explaining technical realities to people who didn't want to hear them, arrived 47 minutes later. Richard had spent those 47 minutes managing Victoria Ashford's schedule adjustments, his own phone, and the increasingly complicated expression of a man watching something he'd hoped wouldn't happen anyway. Ethan Mercer was already gone. His truck was gone from the lot. His $700 check, presumably, was somewhere in his jacket pocket. What remained was his report, open to page 47, sitting on a table in the Meridian terminal. And the aircraft. And the valve. Petra Hollis went into the aft equipment bay with the differential pressure testing kit and her own inspection equipment. She was in there for 31 minutes. When she came out, she went directly to Daniel Brooks and handed him a 1-page summary of what she'd found. He read it. Then he walked to where Victoria Ashford sat with her laptop and her 2 assistants and her lawyer in the terminal's private lounge area. "Ms. Ashford," he said, "I need to speak with you." She looked up from her screen. "The hydraulic engineer has completed her assessment," Daniel said. "The valve fitting was incorrectly installed. She's identified a micro leak at the primary fitting, small enough that it wasn't apparent during ground operations, but under flight conditions and the increased system pressure at altitude, it would have progressed. The flow dynamics on that valve model, installed at the orientation found, create a stress point that—" He stopped, started again. "The aircraft cannot depart." The silence in the lounge was complete for about 3 seconds. "Cannot," Victoria repeated. "Cannot," Daniel confirmed. He set Petra's summary on the table in front of her. "There's also evidence in the maintenance records that the installation documentation was altered. The pressure readings recorded at the 4-day follow-up check are inconsistent with what the engineer found today. Someone changed those numbers." Victoria Ashford looked at the summary. Then she looked at Daniel. Then she looked at the door to the hangar floor, where Richard Hale was standing near the aircraft with his phone at his side, watching them through the glass. She picked up the summary. She began to read. Outside in the parking lot, Ethan's truck was long gone. Inside the terminal, on the table where he'd left it, his report lay open to page 47. The check for $700 sat beside it, unsigned, where Victoria Ashford had set it during their conversation. It was still there, because she'd left without signing it, because she'd been in too much of a hurry to finish reading 43 pages of an aircraft inspection report that a $700 man had written in a hangar at 6:30 in the morning, while the world he moved through did its level best to pretend he wasn't important enough to listen to. His phone rang at 11:47 that morning while he was eating a sandwich in his truck outside his next job. The number was unfamiliar. He let it ring through to voicemail. The message was from someone named Petra Hollis, who identified herself as a hydraulic engineer contracted by Meridian Aviation. She had a calm, efficient voice. She told him she'd reviewed his report. She told him what she'd found in the equipment bay. She told him that if the aircraft had departed that morning, the valve would most likely have failed completely at some point during the climb to cruise altitude. The leak was already progressing. The pressure drop would have triggered warnings and forced an emergency return at minimum, or at worst, a partial hydraulic system failure at altitude. She said the word catastrophic once, plainly, without drama. She told him she thought he should know. Ethan sat with the phone in his hand for a while after the message ended. Then he finished his sandwich. He had another inspection at 2 o'clock. Petra Hollis did not consider herself a dramatic person. She drove a 9-year-old Subaru with a cracked dashboard that she kept meaning to fix. She ate the same lunch 4 days out of 5. And she had a professional reputation built almost entirely on the quality of her assessments, rather than the quality of her personality. She was not someone who used words like catastrophic casually. She used them the way a surgeon used a scalpel, only when the situation required exactly that, and only once. She had used it once in her voicemail to Ethan Mercer. She meant it exactly once. The afternoon she spent at the Meridian terminal after her initial assessment was the kind of afternoon she generally tried to avoid. Too many people in a small space, each of them carrying a different version of what they needed the truth to be. Richard Hale needed it to be a minor installation variance, a technicality, something that could be handled with a notation in the logbook and a revised entry. Victoria Ashford's lawyer needed it to be something ambiguous enough that no one would be assigning liability before anyone had spoken to anyone else. The two assistants needed it to be over quickly. Daniel Brooks just needed someone to confirm what he already knew. Petra gave her preliminary findings to Meridian's on-site maintenance supervisor at 2:15 that afternoon. She kept the language precise and avoided elaboration. The fitting was incorrectly oriented. A micro-leak was present at the primary hydraulic fitting, and the pressure readings in the maintenance record from 6 weeks ago were inconsistent with the physical state of the component she had examined. That last point was the one that made the room go quiet. The maintenance supervisor, a heavy-set man named Gerald Finn, who had been with Meridian for 14 years and had the specific exhaustion of someone who cared about doing his job right and was frequently surrounded by people who didn't, read her preliminary report twice without speaking. Then he looked at her and said, "The numbers were changed. The numbers in the documentation are inconsistent with the physical findings," Petra said carefully. "I'm not in a position to determine intent. That's not my assessment to make." "But the numbers don't match." "No," she said, "they don't." Gerald set the report down. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Richard Hale, who was standing near the window with his phone in his hand and an expression on his face that had, over the course of the afternoon, slowly contracted into something tight and unreadable. "Richard," Gerald said, "I need to see the original work order for the valve maintenance. The physical copy." "It's in the file," Richard said. "I know where it's supposed to be," Gerald said. "I want to see it." The relationship between Richard Hale and Gerald Finn was one of those workplace arrangements that had calcified over years into a kind of mutual tolerance that neither man would have called friendship. Richard had come to Meridian 6 years ago from a larger carrier in Denver, carrying the particular confidence of someone who had managed larger operations and wanted everyone to know it. Gerald had been there since before Richard, and he possessed the equally particular confidence of someone who had no interest in managing anything larger than what was in front of him, as long as what was in front of him was done correctly. They had disagreed on procedural matters before. They had worked around each other's corners for years without any single incident rising to the level of a real confrontation. This was rising to the level of a real confrontation. Gerald drove to the administrative building and pulled the physical maintenance file for N441VA from the records room himself, which was unusual enough that the records clerk, a young woman named Amy, who handled 3 different filing systems and rarely saw a director-level person in that room, watched him from her desk with quiet alertness. He carried the file to the small conference room off the main hall and went through it page by page. The work order for the hydraulic valve maintenance was there. It was signed. It listed the correct certification number for the subcontracted technician. The torque specification was entered as 47 foot-pounds, consistent with the maintenance logbook entry. But the pressure reading from the 4-day follow-up test, the one that showed the system within normal range, was on a form that had a slightly different paper quality than the surrounding documentation. Not dramatically different, but Gerald had been handling maintenance records for 22 years, and the difference registered in the way small inconsistencies registered for people who paid that kind of attention. He held the page up to the fluorescent light. He could see it then. Faint, but there. The ghost of an earlier entry beneath the current numbers. Someone had used correction fluid. The old-fashioned kind, the whiteout that people still kept in desk drawers out of habit, and had written new pressure values over the original ones. The original values were not legible, but the correction fluid was. Gerald set the page down on the table. He sat there for a moment in the quiet of the conference room, with the fluorescent light humming overhead and the distant sound of aircraft on the field outside. Then he picked up his phone and called the VP of Operations. Victoria Ashford did not leave the terminal that afternoon. Her lawyer had counseled patience, which she understood as a legal strategy and resented as a practical reality. Her Seattle meeting had been rescheduled twice already, first to the afternoon, then postponed to the following day, with the kind of vague, apologetic language from her assistant that made clear the deal's other parties were beginning to read something into the delay. She sat in the private lounge with her laptop open and her phone face down on the table, which was a thing she did when she was thinking hard and didn't want the phone pulling her attention. She had a half-eaten salad on the table that she'd stopped noticing around 2 o'clock and hadn't looked at since. She was, by any reasonable accounting, a formidably capable woman. She had built Ashford Holdings from a mid-sized regional logistics company into a diversified portfolio of transportation, technology, and real estate interests over the course of 23 years, starting at 28 with a business she'd inherited from her father and proceeded to triple in value within 5 years through a combination of shrewd acquisitions and a willingness to cut things that weren't working. She did not romanticize the process. She had laid people off. She had walked away from deals that had seemed promising and had terminated partnerships that hadn't performed. She was not cruel about it, but she was not sentimental about it either, and the industry knew it. What she was sitting with now was harder to process than any acquisition decision she'd ever made. Daniel Brooks had laid out the engineer's findings for her in plain language, standing in her lounge with the summary sheet in his hand and his expression carrying that specific quality of a person who knows they're delivering something the listener doesn't want to hear and has decided to do it clearly anyway. He hadn't editorialized. He'd just told her what Petra Hollis had found, what the pressure readings meant, and what Daniel himself believed would have happened if N441VA had departed at 8 o'clock that morning. She'd listened without interrupting. That was not a small thing for her. She interrupted people regularly, not out of rudeness, but out of impatience with the pace at which information was often delivered. She had an efficient brain and a short tolerance for anyone who took 3 sentences to say what 1 sentence could carry. She hadn't interrupted Daniel. When he finished, she'd asked 2 questions. The first was whether there was any possibility Petra Hollis's assessment was wrong. Daniel had said there wasn't. The second was what catastrophic hydraulic failure at altitude meant, in practical terms, for the people on the aircraft. Daniel had told her. She'd sat with that for a moment. Then she'd said, "Thank you, Daniel," in a voice that was quieter than her usual register, and he'd nodded once and left her alone. That had been over an hour ago. Her assistant, Kira, knocked lightly on the lounge door frame. She was 26, efficient, and had worked for Victoria long enough to accurately read her moods. She looked at her now with the careful expression of someone carrying information they weren't sure their boss was ready for. "Gerald Finn's asking to speak with you," Kira said. "He's the maintenance supervisor." "I know who he is," Victoria said. "Send him in." Gerald came in with a file folder under his arm and the unhurried manner of a man who had already decided how this conversation was going to go. He sat down across from her without being invited to, which she noted without comment, and set the file on the table. "I found something in the physical records," he said. "I think you need to see it before anyone else characterizes it for you." He opened the file and turned the page with the pressure reading entry toward her. He explained what he'd found: the correction fluid, the paper inconsistency, the numbers that didn't match Petra's physical findings. Victoria looked at the page for a long time. "You're saying someone altered this," she said. "I'm saying the document shows evidence of alteration," Gerald said. "The original numbers aren't legible, but the readings that are there now aren't consistent with what the engineer found in the actual system." "Who had access to this file?" "Maintenance staff, the records office, and management," Gerald said. He paused. "The subcontractor who performed the valve work. His certification number is in the logbook. I've already reached out to the issuing authority to verify it." Victoria understood what he wasn't saying. The subcontractor's certification number could be verified. What couldn't be verified, but not by Gerald and not in this conversation, was who had decided to alter the pressure readings after the fact. But the circle of people with access to the records and the motivation to hide a substandard result was not a large circle. "Richard approved the subcontractor," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Gerald said. She looked at the page again. "Gerald," she said, "I want you to hold this file and not release it to anyone until I've spoken to legal. Can you do that?" "I can," he said, "but I'd like your word that this doesn't disappear into a process." She looked at him. The directness of it, the plainness of a man who'd been around long enough to know what happened to inconvenient documentation when powerful people got involved with it, landed on her with more force than she expected. "You have my word," she said. He nodded, picked up the file, and left. Victoria sat very still for a moment. Then she reached across the table and turned her phone face up. She scrolled to the contact her assistant had entered 2 hours ago at her request. E. Mercer, independent inspector. She looked at the number. She put the phone back down. Ethan Mercer's 2 o'clock inspection was a Cessna Citation CJ3 at a smaller FBO 15 miles from Harlow Regional, belonging to a real estate developer named Marcus Webb, who flew himself to client meetings and property visits and was meticulous about maintenance in the way that some owner-operators were, not because regulations required it, but because he understood that the aircraft was a machine, and machines didn't care about schedules or intentions. The citation took 2 hours and 20 minutes and came back clean. Marcus Webb made conversation while Ethan worked, in the comfortable, unhurried way of someone with time and good reason to be in a good mood. He'd closed on a commercial property that morning. He offered Ethan a coffee from the FBO's decent machine, and Ethan accepted it because it was better than what he had in his thermos. "You hear about the thing at Harlow this morning?" Marcus said, leaning against his citation's wing. Ethan glanced up. "What thing?" "Gulfstream that was supposed to fly the Ashford woman to Seattle. Got grounded. Something about the hydraulics." Marcus shrugged. "My buddy Dave does ground handling over there. Said there were people in and out of that terminal all afternoon." Ethan made a note in his checklist. He said. Marcus studied him for a moment. "You do work over at Harlow?" "Sometimes," Ethan said. Marcus nodded slowly. He was perceptive enough to understand that the conversation was going to stay exactly where it was and amiable enough not to push it. They finished the inspection. Ethan signed his report, handed Marcus the clean clearance, and accepted a check for his standard rate. Marcus shook his hand and said, "Same time in 6 months." Ethan drove back toward his office, a one-room setup above a storage facility on the east side of town that served as his filing location and his administrative base, though he spent very little time there. He had 3 folding chairs, a desk that had seen better decades, and a filing cabinet that was the most organized thing in the room. He kept the work orders and completed reports in order by date, cross-referenced by aircraft tail number, because he had learned early that the moment you stopped being able to find your documentation was the moment you were exposed. He sat at the desk and checked his messages. There was a callback request from an avionics firm he'd been trying to schedule, a reminder from his accountant about quarterly taxes, and a voicemail from a number he didn't recognize, left at 4:27 that afternoon. He played it. The voice was composed and precise, with the quality of someone choosing words carefully. "Mr. Mercer, this is Victoria Ashford. I believe you inspected N441VA at Meridian Aviation this morning. I'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience." A brief pause. "I also owe you a signed check." Ethan listened to the message a second time. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since he moved in and that he'd been meaning to track down ever since. He was not, by nature, a vindicated person. He didn't keep score in any way that satisfaction could be drawn from. When he found a problem and the problem turned out to be real, his primary response was the same flat, tired relief he felt when a storm warning was correct. Not pleasure at being right, just acknowledgement that the thing he'd been concerned about had been the right thing to be concerned about. He called her back. She answered on the second ring. "Mr. Mercer." "Ms. Ashford, I got your message." "I'll be brief," she said. "I owe you an apology and I owe you a check. I'd prefer to deliver both in person, if you're willing." A pause. "Tomorrow morning, if your schedule allows. Here at the terminal." He thought about that for a moment. "I can do 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock, she confirmed. "Thank you." There was a brief, slightly awkward pause, the kind that happened when 2 people had said what needed saying, but the call hadn't quite found its natural end. "Mr. Mercer," she said, was it as serious as the engineer described?" He considered his response. "Yes," he said. Another pause. "I see." she said. Then, more quietly, "Thank you." She ended the call. Ethan set his phone down on the desk. He thought about what she'd asked and the way she'd asked it. Not like someone building a legal defense, not like someone calculating exposure, just like someone who had been sitting with a specific piece of information all day and needed to hear it confirmed by the person who'd first seen it. He understood that. He'd had that experience himself in the early days, the particular discomfort of having your assessment validated in a way that meant the alternative had actually been possible. It didn't get easier. You just got more accustomed to carrying it. The subcontracted technician's name was Leo Draves. He was 41 years old, held a valid airframe and power plant certification, and had worked as a freelance maintenance contractor for 7 years after leaving a job at a regional MRO facility following what his former employer described, in conversation with the certification authority's investigator, as a pattern of shortcuts and documentation errors. His certification had been reviewed once 2 years ago, following a complaint from an operator in Colorado. The complaint had not resulted in revocation, but it had resulted in a formal notation. Gerald Finn found this out at 5:30 that afternoon when the certification authority called him back. He sat in his truck in the terminal parking lot with this information and thought about what it meant. Leo Draves had been brought in by Richard Hale during a week when 2 of Meridian's regular maintenance staff were out. The work order existed. The certification was valid, technically. The subcontractor had done the job, or had done something that was documented as the job, at the specified torque, with the specified parts. Except the torque seal was missing, the fitting was wrong, and the pressure readings that had been recorded 4 days later, the readings that should have flagged the problem, had been altered. Gerald thought about who had performed that 4-day follow-up test. He pulled the work order. The follow-up pressure test had been signed off by Richard Hale personally, not a technician, not Carlos Rodriguez or any of the regular maintenance staff. Richard Hale, Flight Operations Director, had performed and documented a pressure systems test on an aircraft hydraulic component. Gerald had been around aviation maintenance for a long time. He understood exactly how unusual that was. Directors didn't perform systems tests. That wasn't what directors did. Directors managed processes. Technicians performed tests, unless a director needed a specific result and didn't want a technician involved in producing it. He got out of his truck and went back inside. Richard Hale had spent the afternoon in a state of controlled deterioration. He was a man who had built his career on his ability to manage operational complexity, to keep multiple moving parts coordinated, to solve problems before they became incidents, to maintain the smooth forward motion of a flight operation under the pressure of schedules and client expectations and the 1,000 small failures that aviation routinely produced. He was good at it. He had always been good at it. What he was not good at was sitting still while the thing he had managed carefully for 6 weeks began to come apart. He had approved Leo Draves because Draves was available, certified, and cheap. 2 regular staff members out sick in the same week had created a backlog. Victoria Ashford's flight schedule had demanded the aircraft be ready. The valve issue had been, he told himself at the time, and had continued telling himself, minor, a technical matter, something that could be addressed in the next regular cycle if it needed addressing at all. The pressure readings had been at the low end of normal. He'd looked at them, he'd done the math, and he decided they were close enough. And if they were close enough, and he wrote them in as solidly normal, then there was nothing to flag, nothing to delay, and nothing to explain. He hadn't thought of it as falsification when he did it. He had thought of it as judgment, professional judgment about what the numbers meant in context. He was aware that this was not how regulatory authorities would characterize it. He was sitting in his office, door closed, working through what his options were, when Gerald Finn knocked and came in without waiting for an answer, which was unusual enough that Richard looked up sharply. Gerald set a single sheet of paper on his desk without preamble. It was a printout of the certification authority's file on Leo Draves, the formal notation from 2 years ago, the complaint, the review. "I thought you should have this," Gerald said. Richard looked at it. The color in his face did something complicated. "Gerald, I've also pulled the sign-off on the 4-day follow-up test," Gerald said. "Your signature is on it." The room was very quiet. "I'm not here to have a conversation with you about it," Gerald said. His voice wasn't hostile, it was just clear. I'm telling you what I found because I'm telling the VP of Operations at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, and I wanted you to know before I did." Richard said nothing. Gerald looked at him for a moment, not unkindly, but without any particular softness either. Then he turned and walked out, pulling the door shut behind him. Richard sat in his office with the document on his desk and the sound of the terminal around him, the distant noise of ground equipment, the low hum of the HVAC, the muffled voice of someone on a radio somewhere down the hall. He picked up his phone, put it down, picked it up again. He called his lawyer at 6:15 because there was nothing else to do. Carlos Rodriguez drove home that evening on the same route he always took. Down Harbor Road, across the Millfield Bridge, left on Seneca toward the East Side neighborhood where he'd lived for 11 years, in a house that was too big for one person and that he hadn't gotten around to either selling or filling with anything other than himself and his elderly dog, a beagle named Hatch, who was 12 and slept 18 hours a day and greeted Carlos each evening with enthusiasm that Carlos privately found more sustaining than he was comfortable admitting. He fed Hatch. He made himself pasta because it was fast. He sat at the kitchen table with a beer going warm beside him and thought about the morning. He thought about the valve. He thought about the moment 6 weeks ago when he'd looked at Leo Draves's work and something in his gut had said not right, not loudly, not in any way he could have put a number or a measurement to, just the low background signal of someone who'd spent years with hydraulic systems sensing that a fitting didn't look the way a correctly installed fitting looked. He thought about what he'd done with that signal. He had mentioned it to Richard. Briefly, almost in passing, "The orientation on that auxiliary valve looks a little off to me." And Richard had said the work had been inspected and cleared and to log it and move on, because they were behind and the aircraft needed to be ready by end of week. And Carlos had logged it and moved on. He'd thought about that moment 100 times in the 6 weeks since. It was the specific texture of the regret. Not dramatic, not sharp, just the persistent low-grade awareness that he had known something wasn't right and had let someone talk him out of trusting what he knew. The outside inspector this morning had walked in with his clipboard and his unhurried attention and had found exactly what Carlos had half seen and let go of. And then the inspector had written it on page 47 and left the report on the table and driven out of the parking lot before anyone could tell him he was wrong. Carlos took a long drink of his warm beer. He thought about page 47. He thought about what his role in tomorrow's conversations was going to be. Gerald had called him at 4:30 and told him there would be interviews with the operations VP and possibly with the certification authority. They would want to know what he had observed, when he'd observed it, and what he had done about it. He was going to tell them everything. He wasn't looking forward to it. He wasn't going to pretend, even to himself, that his own conduct had been beyond reproach. He'd seen something that made him uneasy, and he'd let it go because his director told him to, and that was a true and uncomfortable thing about what had happened. But it was what had happened, and the only way through it was straight. He took his plate to the sink. He let Hatch out into the small backyard. He stood on the back porch in the cool evening air and watched the dog move slowly through the grass with his nose down, following whatever trail the yard offered. Hatch raised his head once, looked at Carlos, and wagged his tail once before going back to the grass. Carlos stayed on the porch for a long time, with the night settling around him and the weight of the day sitting in his chest in that particular way that weight sat when you knew it was going to be there for a while before it started to lighten. At 9:47 that evening, Ethan Mercer was at his kitchen table with a stack of completed inspection reports that needed to be filed, and a mug of tea that was cooling at the edge of the table, and his laptop open to the Meridian Aviation Incident Report that the Certification Authority had published in their preliminary evening notification. The notification was brief and factual, as preliminary notifications always were. It identified the aircraft by tail number, noted that a safety concern had been identified during a pre-departure inspection, and stated that the aircraft had been grounded pending further review. It did not mention names. It did not characterize the documentation discrepancy or what had been found in the equipment bay. It mentioned that the initial concern had been raised by an independent inspector. Ethan read that line once. Then he closed the laptop and finished his tea and went through the reports on the table, filing them in the order he'd finished them and putting each one away. He thought about Victoria Ashford's voice on the phone, the specific quality of the pause before she asked whether the valve was as serious as the engineer had described. He had known, in that pause, that she was asking something she'd been sitting with all day. Not the legal version of the question, the real one. He thought about what it cost a person to ask the real version of a question when they'd spent all day with the legal version of it available to them. More than most people gave it credit for, probably. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and the day settled behind him the way days did. Not cleanly, not without remainder, but with the particular completeness of something that had been faced and passed through and would not, at least, need to be faced again tomorrow. The aircraft would need to be repaired. The valve would be correctly reinstalled by someone whose work would be documented and verified. Gerald Finn would give his report to the VP at 8 in the morning. Carlos Rodriguez would tell the certification authority everything he knew. And Richard Hale would have to account for the numbers he'd written in a box on a form that was supposed to mean something. Ethan Mercer slept without difficulty. That was the thing about doing the work the way it was supposed to be done. It didn't make the world simple or clean or fair. It just meant that when you closed your eyes at the end of the day, the question of whether you'd done your part was already answered. Gerald Finn arrived at the Meridian Terminal at 7:43 in the morning, 17 minutes before his scheduled meeting with the VP of Operations, because Gerald Finn arrived early to everything as a matter of principle, and because this particular morning he hadn't been able to sleep past 5 anyway. He'd lain in bed until 5:30, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom he'd shared with his wife Donna for 27 years, and she'd reached over without opening her eyes and put her hand on his arm and said, "Go make coffee," which was her way of acknowledging that he wasn't going to settle and that the kitchen was a better place for that than the bed. He'd made the coffee. He'd sat at the kitchen table with it and gone through his notes one more time, not because the notes had changed overnight, but because going through them again was the thing his brain needed to do before it would agree to stop turning. He carried a folder with him into the building. The physical maintenance file, the pressure test sign-off sheet, the certification authority's notation on Leo Draves, and Petra Hollis's preliminary written assessment, 4 documents that, together, constituted a fairly complete picture of what had happened to N44, 1VA over the previous 6 weeks. Sandra Okafor, VP of Operations for Meridian Aviation, was already in the conference room when he arrived. She was 54, compact, with close-cropped natural hair and the specific quality of attention that senior operations people developed over long careers. She could be looking directly at you while simultaneously tracking 3 other things in her peripheral awareness, and none of the 3 would escape her notice. She had a cup of coffee in front of her and a legal pad with what appeared to be a page of notes already written on it, which told Gerald she'd also been up since early. "Gerald," she said. "Sandra." He sat down and put the folder on the table. She looked at it. "Walk me through it." He did. He was thorough and unhurried about it, which was the only way he knew how to be with something this serious. He took her through the valve maintenance work order, the subcontractor's credentials and the notation in his record, the physical findings from Petra Hollis's assessment, and then, the part he'd spent the most time sitting with, the 4-day follow-up pressure test that Richard Hale had signed off on personally. Sandra listened without interrupting, which was a thing she did when she was processing, and a thing that could be unnerving if you weren't prepared for it. When Gerald finished, she sat with it for a moment. "Richard performed the follow-up test himself," she said. Not a question. "His signature is on the documentation, and the pressure readings he recorded don't match the physical state of the component that Petra examined yesterday," Gerald said. "The valve was leaking. The seal integrity was compromised. If the system had been tested 4 days after installation and the readings had been accurate, the leak would likely have been detectable, or at minimum the pressure curve would have indicated the installation problem. And instead he recorded numbers in the normal range. At the high end of the normal range, Gerald said, which is more convincing than barely normal," Sandra finished. She set her pen down. "He overcorrected." "That's my read," Gerald said. "Someone who was genuinely testing and genuinely getting normal readings would have just written down what they got. You write numbers at the high end of normal when you're thinking about what normal looks like, not when you're actually seeing it." Sandra looked at the file on the table. She picked up the sign-off sheet and examined it. She held it up to the window, the way Gerald had done the day before with the original documentation, and he watched her face when she saw what the light showed. "White out," she said quietly. "The original pressure values are under there. Not legible, but the correction fluid is visible." She set the sheet down carefully, the way you set down something that had become evidence. "I need to know when Richard arrived this morning," she said. Gerald looked at his watch. "His car was in the lot when I got here." Sandra turned to her phone and sent a text. 30 seconds later, it buzzed with a response. She read it, and her expression didn't change, but something in the set of her shoulders shifted slightly. "He's in his office," she said. "Do you want me here for that conversation?" Gerald asked. "Not yet." She stood. "But stay in the building." Richard Hale had also arrived early. He'd arrived at 6:58, parked in his usual spot, and gone directly to his office, where he had been sitting for the past 45 minutes in the particular stillness of a man who has finished doing the calculations and has arrived at a number he doesn't like. He'd spoken to his lawyer for 40 minutes the previous evening. The conversation had been useful in the way that conversations with lawyers were useful. Precise, clarifying, devoid of any comfort. His lawyer had outlined what the documentation trail looked like from outside. He'd used the word exposure 3 times. He'd recommended Richard not discuss the specifics with anyone at Meridian before speaking again with him. Richard had agreed. He'd meant it when he agreed. And then he'd sat in his house alone for 3 hours and thought about what the next week looked like, and the week after, and the conversation he was going to have with his ex-wife about the child support arrangement if his income disappeared, and whether the lawyer's fee was going to exhaust the savings account before any of this was resolved. He was not, by his own accounting, a bad person. He understood that this was the kind of thing bad people also said about themselves, which made the statement almost meaningless, but he meant it in a specific way. He had not set out to endanger anyone. He had made a judgment call about a pressure reading that he'd convinced himself was close enough to acceptable. He had smoothed over a documentation gap because the alternative was a delayed flight and a furious CEO and a subcontractor's error becoming his operational failure. He had not thought at the time about what close enough meant at 39,000 feet. He was thinking about it now. When Sandra knocked on his door and opened it, his first instinct was to stand, which he did, and then felt slightly foolish for doing. She came in and closed the door and sat down across from his desk without any of the preliminary small talk that normally preceded a conversation between them, and he understood from that alone that the preliminary phase of this was already over. "I've been through the file with Gerald," she said. "Sandra, Richard, I need you to listen to me before you say anything." Her voice was not angry. It was the specific tone of someone who had decided that clarity was more useful than emotion in this moment. "The certification authority is going to be here at 10 o'clock. The agency's field office in Portland has already been notified about the incident. I've been on the phone since 6 this morning. There is a process in motion now that is bigger than anything either of us can manage at the operational level." He said nothing. "I'm not going to ask you to explain the pressure test sign-off," she said. "I'm not the right person to be having that conversation, and at this point it's not a conversation that belongs in this room." He looked at the desk. "I made a judgment call." "Richard, I know how that sounds." "Then you know I can't respond to it," she said. "What I can tell you is that your access to operational systems and aircraft documentation is suspended effective right now. Your badge will be collected. HR will be in contact today about the formal process." She paused. "Is there anything in your office that belongs to you personally that you want to take with you?" He looked around the room slowly. There were 3 framed photographs. His daughters at various ages, a candid from a company event 6 years ago when things had felt a lot more manageable, a coffee mug with a chip in the handle that he'd had for 10 years, a collection of procedure manuals on the shelf that were Meridian's property. "The photos," he said. "Take them," she said. She waited while he took the frames off the wall and off the desk and put them under his arm. Then she stood and walked with him to the door, and down the hall, and through the lobby, and out to the parking lot. She didn't do it in a way that felt like an escort. She just walked beside him, which was somehow harder. At his car, he stopped. "Sandra," he said, "I want you to know, I genuinely believed it was fine." She looked at him for a moment. There was something in her face that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't its absence either. Just the complicated expression of someone who knew a person well enough to believe them and also knew that what they believed didn't change what they'd done. "I know," she said. "Get a good lawyer." She went back inside. Richard sat in his car for a long time before he started it. Ethan arrived at the terminal at 8:55. The parking lot felt different from yesterday. There were more vehicles, including one he recognized as a Certification Authority field vehicle, the specific shade of government-issued dark blue that was unmistakable once you'd seen it enough times. He parked and sat for a moment, checking that he had his copy of the inspection report and his notes. He went inside. A receptionist he hadn't spoken to yesterday directed him to a different waiting area than the one he'd sat in the day before. This one was smaller, off the main corridor, with 2 chairs and a table with a water pitcher on it. He waited about 4 minutes before Kira, Victoria Ashford's assistant, appeared and said Ms. Ashford would see him now. Victoria was in the same private lounge, but it looked like a different room than it had yesterday morning. The gleam of the pre-flight energy was gone. There was a second coffee cup on the table that suggested someone had been here before him, and a stack of documents with a legal pad on top. She was standing when he entered, which surprised him slightly. He'd expected the desk chair version of this meeting, the one where the power dynamic was established through furniture. She put her hand out. "Mr. Mercer." He shook it. "Ms. Ashford." "Sit down, please." She sat across from him. She looked like someone who had slept poorly and was functioning through it on caffeine and will. There was a slight tension around her eyes that hadn't been there yesterday, or maybe it had been there and was just more visible now that she wasn't moving fast enough to outrun it. "I understand the certification authority is here," Ethan said. "They arrived at 8, she said. "They'll want to speak with you." She paused. "I wanted to speak with you first." He waited. She reached into the folder in front of her and produced a check. She slid it across the table. It was made out to Ethan J. Mercer for $700, and it was signed. He looked at it. He didn't pick it up yet. "I owe you more than a check," she said. "I know that, but I'll start there." "You don't owe me anything beyond the agreed fee," he said. "I dismissed what you told me," she said. "I questioned your judgment in a way that was not appropriate." She said it with the particular flatness of someone who was being accurate rather than performative about it. Not self-flagellating, just stating a fact she'd had 24 hours to sit with. "I've been building and running companies for 23 years, and the version of me that talked to you yesterday morning was someone who had spent so long getting other people to move faster that I'd stopped distinguishing between the times when moving faster was fine and the times when it wasn't." He considered that. "You're not the first person to react that way. That doesn't make it acceptable." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She looked at him directly. "Petra Hollis gave me a full technical briefing last night. I read her written assessment twice, and I went back and read your report, all of it." She paused. "Page 47 included." He said nothing. "You identified the fitting orientation and the documentation gap on a first inspection, in a hangar, early in the morning, before anyone else who had access to that aircraft for 6 weeks had said a word about it," she said. "And when I told you my schedule mattered more than your concern, you set the report on the table and left." "That's the job," he said. "It's more than the job," she said. "The job is the minimum. What you did was the minimum done with something I'm not sure I can name." She stopped. "I'm sorry for the way I spoke to you, for the $700 remark, for not reading the report." He picked up the check and folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate it." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it wasn't its absence. It was just the acknowledgement of someone who'd received what was offered and understood its weight. She seemed to understand that because she didn't push it further. "The certification authority wants to go through your inspection methodology with you," she said, "and your documentation. They've asked if you'd cooperate." "I'll cooperate fully," he said. "I have everything with me." "Good." She stood. "I'll take you to them." The certification authority field investigators were 2 people. A man named Robert Cantu, who was lead investigator for the regional field office, mid-50s, with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had investigated aviation incidents for a very long time and had learned that patience produced better information than urgency. And a younger woman named Sylvia Marsh, who handled documentation analysis and whose specific expertise Ethan gathered from their initial conversation was in maintenance record falsification cases. Sylvia Marsh's presence was, he understood, not routine. You didn't bring a documentation fraud specialist to a standard maintenance oversight review. You brought her when someone had already decided that what the physical evidence showed needed to be matched against what the paper trail concealed. They set up in the larger conference room and spent 2 hours with Ethan going through his report page by page. Robert asked the questions. Sylvia took notes and occasionally asked follow-up questions about specific entries: the torque seal absence, the fitting orientation, the pressure reading timeline. She asked Ethan to walk her through what specifically had triggered his attention during the physical inspection of the aft equipment bay. He explained the combination of factors: the valve position, the directional flow requirement for that specific model, what a correctly oriented installation looked like versus what he'd found. "You've worked with this valve model before?" she asked. "Several times. It's common in this aircraft type." So the orientation discrepancy would have been obvious to someone familiar with the component, yes, he said. Not obvious to someone doing a general visual check without knowing specifically what to look for. Sylvia wrote something down. "And the torque seal?" "Missing from the physical fitting and unmentioned in the documentation," Ethan said. "A correctly performed installation should have both." She looked at him over her notepad. "In your professional assessment, is it possible that the installation was performed correctly by the subcontractor and the documentation gap was simply a clerical failure?" Ethan thought about the question carefully, because it was a careful question. In isolation, the missing torque seal documentation could be a clerical error. In isolation, the fitting orientation, if my eye was somehow off, might be within tolerance. But the combination of an absent torque seal, a fitting that reads as incorrectly oriented, and pressure system test readings that Petrohollis's physical assessment doesn't support, he stopped. "No, I don't think the installation was performed correctly." Robert Cantu had been listening from across the table. "That's consistent with Petrohollis's assessment," he said. "It wasn't a compliment, and it wasn't confirmation. Just a statement that two independent technical findings were pointing in the same direction." "I know," Ethan said. They finished with him at 11:30. Robert shook his hand and told him his cooperation was appreciated, and they would be in contact if they needed anything further. Sylvia gave him a card and asked that he not dispose of any of his original notes or inspection materials related to the N441 VA review. He told her he wouldn't. He was gathering his things when Sylvia Marsh said, almost as an aside, not looking up from her notes, "Mr. Mercer, the follow-up pressure test documentation. The sign-off was by the flight operations director." He looked at her. "I saw that." "Did it register as unusual when you reviewed the maintenance records?" He paused. "It registered," he said. "Directors don't usually perform systems tests personally." "Did you note it in your report?" "I noted the certification number and the sign-off name, yes," he said. "Whether the methodology of the test itself was unusual wasn't something I was in a position to assess from documentation alone. That's a management oversight question, not an inspection methodology question." She nodded and wrote something. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." Well, Carlos Rodriguez arrived for his interview with the investigators at noon. He'd been told by Gerald that morning to expect the meeting and to come prepared to walk through his own involvement in the valve maintenance process from the beginning, what he'd observed, when, and what he'd done about it. Gerald had told him to be straightforward and complete, and had said it in the tone of someone who'd thought about whether to say anything beyond that, and had decided not to. Carlos had appreciated the restraint. He sat down across from Robert Cantu and Sylvia Marsh with his hands flat on the table in front of him, and told them everything he knew in the order it had happened. He told them about the week the two regular technicians had been out sick. He told them about Leo Draves arriving to do the valve work, a man he'd met once before at a trade maintenance event, who'd seemed competent in conversation, but whom Carlos had not observed actually working. He told them about going back to check Draves's work the afternoon after it was completed, and the specific quality of the unease he'd felt looking at the fitting. Not alarm, not certainty, just that low background signal his body produced when something wasn't right. He told them about mentioning it to Richard Hale. The exact words, as best he could remember them. The orientation on that auxiliary valve looks a little off to me. He told them what Richard had said, that the work had been inspected and cleared and to log it and move on. "And you logged it?" Robert asked. "In my daily notes," Carlos said. "Not in the formal maintenance documentation. That wasn't my—" He stopped. "I didn't have the authority to add an unresolved notation to the formal log without supervisor approval." "Did you ask for supervisor approval to add a notation?" Carlos looked at the table. "No," he said. "I raised the concern verbally, and I was told it was addressed, and I let it go." Sylvia Marsh's pen was moving across her notepad. "Mr. Rodriguez," Robert said, "when the independent inspector's report circulated yesterday morning, when you saw page 47, what was your reaction?" Carlos was quiet for a moment, not organizing a story, just finding the honest language for a thing that had been sitting in him for 24 hours. "Relief," he said, "and something that felt like shame." Robert Cantu didn't react. He just waited, in the way that good investigators waited, not pressing, not filling the silence, just creating the space for someone to finish what they were saying. "I'd seen it," Carlos said, 6 weeks ago. Not as clearly as Mercer did, and I couldn't have written it up the way he did because I wasn't sure enough, and I didn't have his specific knowledge of that valve model. But I'd seen something, and I let someone tell me I was wrong." He took a breath. "If the aircraft had departed yesterday morning and something had happened—" "It didn't depart," Sylvia said. Not unkindly, just clearly. "I know," Carlos said, "but if it had—" Nobody said anything for a moment. "Is there anything else you want to add that you think is relevant?" Robert asked. Carlos thought about it. "Leo Draves," he said, "when he was on site doing the work, he was on the job for about 3 hours. The valve reinstallation on that model, done correctly with all the documentation requirements, should take closer to 5. He watched Robert Cantu write something down. Petra Hollis spent the morning in the equipment bay of N441VA with a second engineer she'd requested from a certified MRO facility in the next county, a man named Tom Shea, who had 25 years in hydraulic systems specifically and who arrived with his own pressure testing equipment and the compact energy of someone who genuinely found this sort of problem interesting. They worked through the morning without much conversation, which suited Petra because Tom Shea was the kind of engineer who understood that close work and talking were generally incompatible, and because the equipment bay was not a comfortable space for extended discussion, even if you wanted to have one. What they found, working together and thoroughly, was this. The primary hydraulic fitting had been installed with the torque specification met. The 47 foot-pounds in the log was, by the physical evidence of the fitting's resistance profile, accurate. But the angular orientation of the fitting relative to the valve body was off by approximately 4 degrees from the installation specification for that model. 4 degrees was, in a static system on the ground, essentially invisible. In a dynamic system at altitude, under the thermal expansion of flight operating temperatures and the pressure loads generated during active control surface deployment, that 4-degree misalignment created a cyclical stress point at the seal interface. The microleak Petra had identified the day before had progressed. Not dramatically, the aircraft had not been operational, but the seal had continued to weep slightly from the stress of even ground-level atmospheric and temperature variation over the previous 24 hours. Tom Shea looked at the fitting for a long time. Then he looked at Petra. "If this aircraft had gone to cruise altitude," he said. He didn't finish the sentence. "I know," Petra said, "and the follow-up test 4 days post-installation showed normal pressure." "The documentation shows normal pressure," Petra said. "What the test actually showed is not something I can determine." Tom was quiet for a moment. "The leak would have been detectable at that stage," he said. "If the test was performed properly with calibrated equipment, the curve would have been wrong. You wouldn't necessarily see a leak with your eyes at ground pressure, but the curve would have been off." Petra nodded. "So either the test wasn't performed," Tom said, "or it was performed and the result was adjusted." That's a finding for the authority, Petra said. Not us. I know, Tom said. He turned back to the fitting. Let's document everything. They documented everything. Petra's secondary report ran to 11 pages, with photographs and pressure curve data and a technical narrative that walked through the installation failure, the seal degradation timeline, and the projected system behavior under flight conditions. She wrote it with the same dry precision she brought to everything, because precision was the only version of this kind of finding that was useful. She submitted it to the certification authority at 2:45 in the afternoon. She sent a copy to Gerald Finn. She did not send a copy to anyone in Meridian's management above operations level, because she understood without being told that the chain of trust in that direction was, at the moment, compromised. The afternoon brought a stillness to the Meridian terminal that felt like the specific quiet after something loud is ended. The investigators continued their interviews. They spoke with 2 other maintenance staff members, with the records clerk, Amy, and briefly with Daniel Brooks, who gave them a precise account of his review of Ethan's report and his decision to ground the aircraft, and who answered every question in the same level voice he'd used with Richard the day before. Daniel had been a pilot for 23 years. He had sat in front of enough instruments in enough conditions to have developed a very clear sense of what mattered and what didn't. What mattered was what you did with the information you had in front of you. Everything else was downstream of that. He'd been asked by one of the Meridian board members who had arrived that afternoon whether he felt his decision to ground the aircraft had been validated by subsequent findings. The decision was correct when I made it, he said. The subsequent findings confirmed that, yes. The board member looked like he'd expected a different answer. Daniel didn't offer one. Victoria spent the afternoon in back-to-back calls. Her legal team, the board, the other party in the Seattle deal, whose patience was beginning to fray in ways that her assistant reported with increasing delicacy. The Seattle deal was not dead, but it was in the kind of suspension that required active maintenance, and Victoria was having to spend energy keeping it there that she'd expected to spend closing it. She managed it. That was the thing about her. She was genuinely good at managing difficult things. She'd just been applying that capability in a direction that, on this particular morning 24 hours ago, had been the wrong direction. At 4 o'clock, she asked Kira to get Ethan Mercer on the phone. He answered on the 3rd ring. Ms. Ashford, he said, the authority has asked me for a formal statement about the sequence of events yesterday morning, she said. Specifically my interaction with you before departure. I expected they would. My statement will be accurate, she said. I want you to know that before you hear it from them. He was quiet for a moment. I appreciate that. There's something else, she said. She paused, in the way she paused when she was deciding whether to say a thing she'd been sitting with. The certification authority asked me if I believed your inspection was conducted professionally and in accordance with standard methodology. What did you tell them? I told them it was conducted more professionally than my response to it, she said, and that any failure in the sequence of events yesterday morning was not in the inspection. He didn't say anything immediately. Mr. Mercer, she said, I have a board meeting tomorrow at which I'll be asked to provide a full account of this incident. I expect some of those questions are going to be about systemic issues in our operational culture. And I think, she stopped, I think the honest answer to those questions is going to be uncomfortable. Usually is, he said. Yes, she said. I imagine you see that version of things fairly often in your line of work. More often than I'd like, he said. People are generally not trying to create the problems. They're usually trying to manage something else. And the problem is what happens in the space they left. She was quiet for a moment. That's a precise way of describing it. It's what I've seen, he said, for what it's worth. She thanked him. She ended the call. She sat in the private lounge for a few minutes after that with her phone on the table, thinking about what he'd said. The problem is what happens in the space they left. It was a plain sentence. It wasn't poetic. It was just accurate in a way that ran from the valve in the aft equipment bay all the way up through the culture of her company, through the culture of her own expectations, through the 23 years of building something that moved fast and expected everyone around it to move fast, and had somewhere along the way stopped leaving enough space for anyone to say, wait. She stood and walked to the window. The Gulf Stream was still in the hangar. The external access panel to the aft equipment bay was still open from Petra and Tom's morning work. Under the hangar lights, it looked exactly like what it was, a magnificent and precisely engineered machine that had been, almost imperceptibly, wrong. Almost imperceptibly. 44 years old, $700, a Tuesday morning, and the patience to look at a fitting long enough to notice 4 degrees of misalignment. She turned away from the window. She had a board meeting to prepare for, and a Seattle deal to keep alive, and a company that was, as of this moment, in the process of discovering exactly how much it didn't know about itself. That was going to take a while. She picked up her legal pad and started writing. Ethan called his attorney Monday morning at 8:15. Her name was Claire Ewan, and she had handled his business contracts and liability matters for 6 years with the kind of efficient pragmatism that he valued in professionals. She didn't over-explain, she didn't under-deliver, and she charged him exactly what she said she was going to charge him, which was rarer than it should have been. He'd emailed her the Ashford Holdings proposal Sunday evening with a short note that said, "Need your eyes on this before I respond." And she'd apparently read it the same night because when she answered Monday morning, she already had her notes in front of her. "Conflict question is manageable," she said, without preamble. "The investigation is a regulatory proceeding focused on the maintenance certification and the documentation falsification. Your role is as a fact witness with documentation of record. The consultancy is a separate contractual arrangement with the operator concerning their internal safety reform process. As long as the consultancy contract explicitly excludes any involvement in matters that are currently subject to the authority's investigation, and as long as you disclose the arrangement to the authority's lead investigator, there's no conflict that would compromise your standing." "You're comfortable with it," he said. "Professionally, yes. Personally," a brief pause. "You're sure about what you're walking into? This woman runs a billion-dollar portfolio. A 6-month consultancy with an open mandate sounds clean on paper. In practice, it can get complicated." "I know," he said. "She's going to want you to find things she can manage. You're going to find things she can't. That's the job," he said. Claire was quiet for a second. "All right. I'd want 3 changes to the indemnification clause and the termination language before you sign. I'll mark them up and send them back today." "Thank you," he said. "Ethan," she paused. "The fee they're offering, don't let it change how you work." He looked out the window of his office at the parking lot below, where a pigeon was doing something determined and futile with a crushed piece of food on the asphalt. "It won't," he said. He was fairly certain he meant it. The certification authority's formal investigation proceeded through November with the methodical, unhurried pace of a regulatory process that understood it was building a record that would outlast the urgency of the people involved in it. Robert Cantu and Sylvia Marsh had accumulated, by the 3rd week of the investigation, somewhere north of 400 pages of documentation. Maintenance records, interview transcripts, technical assessments, Petra Hollis's reports, Tom Shea's supplemental analysis, Ethan's original inspection report, and his subsequent formal statement, the work orders and certification records for Leo Draves, the personnel files and communications records subpoenaed from Meridian Aviation's administrative systems. The picture that emerged was not, in its essential structure, complicated. It was, as these things tended to be, a simple failure dressed up in layers of organizational complexity. Leo Draves had performed an installation that was technically close to correct in most respects, and wrong in the one respect that mattered, the 4-degree fitting orientation that the installation notes, had he checked a legible copy, would have specified differently. He had omitted the torque seal because he ran out and had not sourced a replacement. He had been on site for approximately 3 hours on a job that should have taken closer to 5, and the time discrepancy was consistent with a technician who was moving faster than the work required. Richard Hale had approved the subcontractor's work without a qualified technician reviewing it. He had performed the 4-day follow-up pressure test himself, unusual on its face and in context clearly motivated by the desire to control the recorded outcome. The values he had written were not the values the system produced. Sylvia Marsh's analysis of the documentation, compared against the physical state of the valve and the pressure curve data from Petra Hollis's subsequent testing, established with reasonable certainty that the readings Richard had recorded were fabricated. The correction fluid over the original values, which Sylvia's team had been able to partially recover using photographic enhancement techniques, showed numbers consistent with the low-end readings the system would have actually produced given the valve's installed condition. He had known. Not that it would kill anyone, perhaps. The self-deception about close enough was probably genuine at some level. But he had known the readings weren't right, and he had written different ones, and that knowing was the difference between a judgment call and a falsification. Robert Cantu presented the investigation's preliminary findings to the authority's regional director in the second week of November. The findings included a formal determination of maintenance documentation falsification, a finding of inadequate subcontractor oversight, and a recommendation for referral to the appropriate prosecutorial authority for consideration of criminal charges related to the documentation fraud. There was also a finding about the operator, Ashford Holdings, and Meridian Aviation, that characterized the organizational culture as one in which safety reporting mechanisms were insufficient and in which operational pressure had demonstrably contributed to conditions enabling the maintenance failure. This finding stopped short of assigning criminal liability to the organization, but it was specific, and it was on the record, and it meant that the remediation steps Ashford Holdings took in the subsequent months would be monitored and measured against a documented baseline. Victoria received the preliminary findings on a Wednesday afternoon from her general counsel, who walked her through them in the same conference room where she'd met with Ethan the previous Friday. She read the relevant sections herself, which her counsel had not expected her to do on the spot, but she did. She read the section about the organizational culture, finding twice. "Is this the final language?" she asked. "Preliminary," he said. "There's a 30-day comment period." "I'm not going to comment on the organizational finding," she said. He looked at her carefully. "Victoria, there's language in there that—" "It's accurate," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Responding to accurate findings in regulatory proceedings isn't always—" "I know the strategy," she said. "I'm telling you I'm not going to pursue it. The finding stands." She set the document down. "What I want you to focus on is the remediation section. I want our response to be specific and actionable, not general. I want timelines, responsible parties, and a commitment to third-party verification of each item." Her counsel looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a lawyer who was reassessing a client he thought he understood. "All right," he said. "I'll draft it that way." Richard Hale's situation resolved, or rather arrived at its formal beginning, in the third week of November, when the authorities' referral resulted in a formal criminal complaint for falsification of aviation safety records. His attorney had anticipated it. Richard, when David Park called him with the news, was quiet for a long time before he said anything. What he said, finally, was, "Okay." David waited for more. There wasn't more. "Richard," he said, "we're going to move through this. It's not going to be quick, but it's going to be manageable." "I know," Richard said. His voice had the specific flatness of someone who had spent weeks arriving at a kind of acceptance that wasn't peace but was adjacent to it. The acceptance of a person who has finally stopped running calculations about an outcome they can't change and has started calculating about the one they're actually in. His daughters were 11 and 14. They lived with their mother 40 minutes away. He had seen them every other weekend and most of their school events, and that had been one of the things he'd been most afraid of losing when this started. Not his career, not his professional standing, but the particular ordinary rhythm of showing up for the mundane things that parents showed up for. The recitals and the games and the Sunday dinners that didn't mean anything individually and meant everything collectively. He talked to his ex-wife, whose name was Diane, on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks into the investigation. The conversation had been uncomfortable in several layers. There was the history between them, which was not uncomplicated, and there was the new information she was processing, which was not comfortable, and there was the question of what the coming months would look like for the girls. Diane had listened without interrupting, which was not her default mode, which told him she was taking it seriously. When he finished, she'd said, "Did anyone get hurt?" "No," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Then we figure it out," she said. "The girls need to know something is happening so they're not blindsided. but we figure out what to tell them together. He'd expected something harder from her and had been, in a way that surprised him, undone by the absence of it. Not because she'd been generous, she'd been practical, in the way she was practical about most things, but because practical felt like enough, in that moment, and he hadn't known it would. "Thank you," he'd said. "Don't thank me," she'd said. "Just don't do anything else stupid." "I won't," he said. He meant that with everything he had. Gerald Finn was given, in the second week of November, the title of Interim Director of Maintenance Operations at Meridian Aviation. The interim was an acknowledgement that the role was being restructured and that a permanent appointment would follow a review process. The salary adjustment was modest. The scope of the role was substantially larger than what he'd held before. He sat with Sandra Okafor for an hour when she offered it, not because he was uncertain about accepting, but because he wanted to understand what the offer meant in the context of what was changing and what wasn't. "The new safety reporting channel," he said. "Is that actually happening, or is it in the category of things that get discussed when something goes wrong and then quietly don't happen?" "Carol Prentice is personally overseeing the implementation," Sandra said. "She's set a 60-day deadline and she's going to be calling me to confirm progress at the 30-day mark. It's happening." "Anonymous reporting," he said. "Anonymous reporting," Sandra confirmed. "No retaliation policy with actual teeth. We're bringing in an external HR firm to handle complaints, so there's no internal chain of command involved." He nodded slowly. "The subcontractor approval process." "Being rewritten. No outsourced maintenance work without dual sign-off from a senior tech and a director, and the senior tech has to be someone who has physically reviewed the work." "That should have existed before," Gerald said. "Yes," Sandra said. "It should have." He looked at her. "Why me?" She looked back at him steadily. "Because you went and pulled the physical file yourself," she said. "And because when you found what was in it, you went to Victoria with it instead of managing around her." She paused. "And because the people who watch what you do every day, Carlos Rodriguez, Amy in records, the rest of the maintenance team, they trust you. Right now, that matters more than seniority." He thought about that. "All right," he said. "All right, you'll take it?" "All right, I'll take it," he said. "But I want something in writing about the reporting channel timeline before I sign anything." Sandra almost smiled. "I'll have it drafted today." Ethan started his engagement with Ashford Holdings on the first Monday of November, 3 days after Claire Ewan confirmed the contract changes had been accepted and the indemnification language revised to her satisfaction. He drove to the Meridian terminal that morning with his own files and a yellow legal pad and a cup of coffee from the decent machine at the FBO on the north side, because the Meridian terminal's coffee, in his experience, was not worth depending on. Gerald Finn met him at the door. They'd spoken twice by phone in the preceding week and had established, without much ceremony, a working relationship based on the understanding that they were both people who preferred direct information to managed information, and that the next 6 months would go better if that remained the baseline. "Where do you want to start?" Gerald said. "Documentation review," Ethan said. "All maintenance records for the past 18 months, all subcontractor approvals, all follow-up testing sign-offs. I want to see who signed what and when, and I want to cross-reference the sign-offs against the certification status of the person signing." Gerald nodded. "I'll pull them." "And I want to talk to your technicians," Ethan said. "Not in a formal interview setting, just talk. I want to know what they see in their regular work that they don't put in the documentation because they don't know if they should." Gerald looked at him for a moment. "That's going to take some doing. Some of them are going to be cautious about talking to a consultant." "I know," Ethan said. "That's useful information too." They walked into the terminal together, past the private lounge where Victoria had dismissed Ethan's concern 4 weeks ago, past the table where he'd left his report open to page 47, out to the hangar floor where N441 VA sat in its bay, fully repaired now. The aft equipment bay panel closed and sealed, the valve correctly installed and documented and verified by 2 independent engineers and a certification authority inspector. The aircraft had been recertified for flight the previous week. It looked exactly the way it had looked on a Tuesday morning 4 weeks ago. Magnificent, precise, and entirely indifferent to what had nearly happened inside its walls. Ethan looked at it for a moment, then turned toward the records office. He had work to do. Eek. The first 3 weeks of the engagement produced a documentation audit that ran to 67 pages, which Ethan presented to Sandra Okafor and Gerald Finn in the second week of November with a directness that Sandra later described to Victoria as not comfortable, but exactly what we needed. The audit identified 11 instances over the 18-month review period in which maintenance documentation showed gaps or inconsistencies similar in character, though not in severity, to the valve installation record. Most were minor. Missing secondary sign-offs, follow-up test documentation completed the same day as the initial work in ways that strained credibility given the time required, a handful of certification numbers that had been entered incorrectly and never corrected. None of them were falsification. None of them involved an active safety defect, but they were the texture of a system that had gotten comfortable with approximation. With close enough, with probably fine, with we're behind schedule and this is minor, the culture of the thing, visible in the small accumulations of paperwork, the same way the culture of a household was visible in what ended up in the corners and under the furniture when no one had cleaned carefully in a while. Ethan presented it without editorializing because editorializing wasn't the job. He identified what was there. The interpretation was Gerald's and Sandra's and ultimately Victoria's. Victoria read the full report on a Thursday evening at her desk. She read it in the way she'd read Ethan's inspection report for N441VA. All of it, in order, slowly. She made notes in the margins in her cramped, fast handwriting, the kind of handwriting that revealed something about a person who had always moved at a pace slightly faster than the writing hand could sustain. She called Ethan that evening. The 11 instances, she said, in your assessment, is the pattern consistent across the operation, or is it concentrated in specific roles or processes? Both, he said. There are 2 technicians who show up in 6 of the 11, and there's a scheduling pattern. The gaps tend to cluster around your peak travel periods when the aircraft is turning over faster. So the pressure is shaping the behavior even at the documentation level, she said. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a moment. I want to address the 2 technicians individually. Not punitively. I want to understand what they're experiencing, whether the gaps are coming from time pressure or from not knowing what the standard requires or from something else. Gerald's already planning those conversations, Ethan said. He asked me to sit in on them if that's acceptable to you. More than acceptable, she said. It's the right approach. He was quiet for a second, and she noticed the quality of that quiet, not uncertainty. Just the pause of someone deciding whether to say something they weren't sure fit the professional context. You can say what you're thinking, she said. It's just... He stopped. The technicians who show up in those 6 instances, from what I've seen of the work environment here, I'd be surprised if what's driving the gaps is laziness or carelessness. The more likely explanation is that they've learned over time that slowing down to complete documentation fully creates friction with scheduling, and the friction has consequences, and the documentation gaps don't, or didn't, create visible consequences. So the rational response is to accommodate the schedule. You're describing the incentive structure, she said. I'm describing what the incentive structure produces, he said. The incentive structure is your problem to address. She heard the precision of the distinction. He wasn't blaming her for what the technicians had done. He was locating, as accurately as he could, where the responsibility actually sat. Thank you, she said, for being that specific. That's the job, he said. And this time it didn't sound like deflection. It sounded like what it was. The straightforward description of a person who had decided, at some point, that doing one thing well and honestly was sufficient purpose for a working life. Shatsu. Carlos Rodriguez attended a mandatory documentation training session in the 3rd week of November, which Gerald had organized in collaboration with Ethan's recommendations. It covered completion standards, the correct procedure for flagging concerns in formal documentation, and the new anonymous reporting channel and how to use it. 11 people were in the room. Carlos sat toward the back. He listened to everything and asked no questions during the session, which was not his normal behavior. He was generally someone who asked questions when he had them. But he was thinking rather than confused, and the two required different responses. After the session ended and most people had left, he stayed to help stack the chairs, which was a habit he'd developed years ago and had never thought to explain. Gerald was still in the room, rolling up a projected diagram. "Carlos," Gerald said. "Yeah." "The new process. If you have a concern about a component, verbally telling me isn't enough anymore. You know that." Carlos looked at him. "I know that. It goes in writing, either directly into the maintenance log with a formal notation or through the reporting channel if you're not comfortable with direct documentation for some reason." Gerald paused. "The second option exists precisely so that the conversation you had with Richard about the valve doesn't end the same way." "I understand," Carlos said. "Good." Gerald picked up the rolled diagram. "You should also know that your interview with the authority investigators will be part of the formal record. What you said about raising the concern verbally, that's documented." Carlos looked at the floor for a moment. "I know. The way it reads," Gerald said carefully, "is that you identified something, you raised it through the only channel available to you at the time, and your supervisor overrode your concern. The inadequacy was in the channel, not in you." "I could have pushed harder," Carlos said. "Yes," Gerald said, "you could have. And that's something you're going to carry regardless of how the authority characterizes it." He paused. "But the system should have made it easier for you to push harder without it costing you something. That's on the system. And the system is changing." Carlos was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't make the valve unbroken," he said. "No," Gerald said. "It doesn't. But the valve is fixed, and the next time someone sees something that doesn't look right, they'll have a place to put it that doesn't depend on whether their supervisor is having a good day." Carlos thought about that. He picked up the last two chairs and stacked them against the wall. "Gerald," he said, "the outside inspector, Mercer." "What about him?" "He saw it in one morning," Carlos said. "I was around that aircraft for 6 weeks." "You saw something in 6 weeks," Gerald said. He knew specifically what he was looking for. That's what 11 years of doing one thing carefully produces. Carlos nodded slowly. He didn't find this entirely comforting, but it was accurate, and accurate was something he could work with. Leo Draves surrendered his airframe and power plant certification voluntarily in the first week of December, before the authority's formal action concluded. His attorney had negotiated an arrangement with the authority that acknowledged his cooperation with the investigation and his candid account of the installation process, and the voluntary surrender was part of that arrangement, cleaner in its way than a revocation proceeding, and one that left a narrower door for potential future reinstatement if he pursued the remediation pathway the authorities' framework allowed. He spent the weeks after the surrender doing what people did when a working identity disappeared, not dramatically, but with the specific disorientation of someone who had organized their time and their sense of themselves around a skill and a certification, and suddenly had neither confirmed. He took on some general mechanical work at a friend's automotive shop. He got up early out of habit and had nowhere particular to be, which was its own kind of adjustment. He thought about the torque seal often. He thought about it the way you thought about the moment just before a small, quiet, bad decision. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that happens in the gap between being careful and being rushed, when the careful thing is right there and the rushed thing is easier and the consequences seem remote. He had made the rushed choice so many times before without consequence that the one time it mattered had not felt different from the times it hadn't. That was the thing about the small compromises. They felt the same every time, right up until they didn't. The 6-month consultancy engagement reached its formal midpoint in early January, and Ethan presented a progress report to Victoria, Sandra, and Gerald in the Ashford Holdings boardroom. Not the smaller conference room, the actual boardroom, with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the long oval table, which felt like a statement of some kind even if no one commented on it. The progress report covered the documentation audit findings and the remediation steps taken so far. The 2 technicians who had been individually counseled, the updated subcontractor approval process, the anonymous reporting channel, now operational for 3 weeks with 4 reports received, and each one handled through the new external HR process. It covered the revised training program and the new sign-off requirements for outsourced maintenance work. It also covered, in the final section, what hadn't been fixed yet, the areas where the changes were structural and would take longer than 3 months to fully embed. The scheduling pressure on maintenance staff hadn't disappeared just because a policy had been written. Culture didn't change on a timeline. It changed in the accumulation of individual decisions made by individual people in individual moments, and 3 months was enough time to change the policy framework, but not enough time to change what people instinctively did when the schedule was tight, and the documentation felt like the last thing that mattered. Victoria asked him about this directly. How do we know the change is real and not just compliance? You probably won't know for a year or two, he said. Maybe more. You'll know it's happening when someone in this organization stops a scheduled departure over a safety concern, and the professional consequence for that person is nothing. When that happens enough times that stopping a departure becomes a normal thing that normal people do without calculating the cost, you'll know. She looked at him. And until then? Until then, you watch the documentation. You count the anonymous reports. You track whether people are raising concerns earlier in the process instead of later or not at all. He paused. And you read the inspection reports yourself. All of them. Every page. She held his gaze. Every page, she said. Every page, he confirmed. The silence in the boardroom had a specific quality. Not uncomfortable, but weighted in the way that moments were weighted when they contained more than the words that had been spoken in them. Harris Lund, who had been sitting at the far end of the table listening to the presentation with his characteristic stillness, said, Mr. Mercer, in your experience in this industry, is what we're attempting here actually achievable? Or is it the kind of reform that looks good on paper and erodes the moment the immediate pressure is off? It was the most direct question anyone had asked him in 6 months, and he appreciated it. It's achievable, he said. I've seen it done. Not often and not easily, and not without the person at the top being willing to have the same conversation about accountability in month 18 that they had in month 1, when it's no longer a crisis and everyone has moved on. He looked at Victoria. The crisis creates the will. The test is whether the will survives the normality that follows. She didn't look away. That's a fair characterization, she said. It's an honest one, he said, which is what you hired me for. Harris Lund made a short sound that might have been approval. The formal proceedings against Richard Hale concluded in the second week of January with a plea agreement that his attorney and the prosecuting authority had been working toward for 2 months. He pled to 1 count of falsification of aviation safety records, a federal offense, in exchange for cooperation with the authorities' investigation and a sentencing recommendation that took into account the absence of any actual harm and his complete cooperation once the formal process began. The sentencing was scheduled for March. David Park had told him the likely outcome: significant financial penalties, probation, permanent revocation of any aviation management certifications, and a federal record. No prison time, barring something unexpected in the pre-sentencing report. Richard had listened and nodded and said, "When can I see my daughters?" David looked at him. "That's not affected by any of this. That's between you and Diane." "I know," Richard said. "I'm not asking legally. I'm just—" He stopped. "I'm asking because seeing them is the thing I keep thinking about." David Park, who had a daughter of his own who was 9, and who had her father's stubborn streak and her mother's laugh, said, "Call Diane. That's outside my area." Richard had called Diane that evening. She'd said the girls could come over Saturday if he wanted, and she'd make sure they knew to come ready for a long dinner, which was her way of saying she understood that he needed time with them, not just a few hours. He'd cooked for them on Saturday, nothing elaborate, pasta with a sauce he'd been making since they were small, a recipe he'd learned from his own mother and that his older daughter had recently started asking to learn. She stood beside him at the counter that Saturday, 14 years old and serious about it, watching his hands and asking questions, and he'd walked her through every step slowly, more slowly than he needed to for the sauce to turn out right, because the point wasn't the sauce. He thought, stirring the pot, about 9 people on an aircraft. He thought about that fairly often. He suspected he would for a long time. Ethan's engagement with Ashford Holdings ran its full 6 months, ending in late April. The final report was 89 pages, which was not what he'd planned when he started, but was what the work required. Victoria received it on a Wednesday and read it over 2 evenings, all of it in order, with the margins of her copy filling with her cramped, fast handwriting. She called him on Friday morning. "I want to renew the engagement," she said. "Another 12 months. Reduce scope. I'm not asking for the same intensive audit, but I want you in the building quarterly. I want your eyes on the documentation twice a year, and I want you available to Daniel Brooks when he has a question about something he's seeing." He was sitting at his desk above the storage facility. The pigeon that had been doing something futile in the parking lot for months had apparently resolved its situation, because he hadn't seen it in weeks. The filing cabinet was full in a way that required him to start a second one, which he'd been putting off purchasing. "That's a longer-term arrangement than I usually take," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm asking anyway." He thought about it. He thought about the 11 documentation gaps and the 2 technicians and the anonymous reporting channel with its 4 reports in 3 weeks, each one handled without consequence to the person who filed it. He thought about Gerald Finn pulling a physical maintenance file at 7:30 in the morning because something didn't feel right. He thought about Daniel Brooks on the air stairs of a Gulfstream, holding a report and telling a flight operations director they weren't moving the aircraft. He thought about page 47. "Same terms as the original contract," he said. "Claire Ewan will want to review any changes." "Of course," Victoria said. "And I want a standing meeting with Gerald. Monthly. Nothing formal. Just a conversation about what he's seeing." "Done," she said. "All right," he said. He heard her exhale. Not with relief exactly. More with the specific quality of someone who had been working towards something for 6 months and had just confirmed it was going to continue. Which wasn't satisfaction, so much as the acknowledgement that the work wasn't finished and wouldn't be finished in any clean way, and that this was, nevertheless, the right thing. "Thank you, Ethan," she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He noticed it the way you notice something that had been building incrementally, not as a surprise, just as the arrival of a thing that had been approaching for a while. "See you in July," he said. On a Thursday morning in late May, N441V, a departed Harlow Regional Airport at 7:58, carrying Victoria Ashford and 4 members of her executive team to a conference in Phoenix. The flight was scheduled, the maintenance documentation was complete, the pre-departure inspection had been conducted by a certified Meridian technician and reviewed by Gerald Finn. Daniel Brooks was in the left seat. The aircraft was, by every measure available, airworthy. Before boarding, Victoria stood at the top of the air stairs for a moment with the boarding folder in her hand. The folder contained the flight plan, the weather briefing, the weight and balance calculation, and the maintenance sign-off package, everything that accompanied a scheduled departure. She opened the folder. She turned to the maintenance documentation section and read through it, page by page, in the particular unhurried way she had been practicing for 6 months, not scanning for the shape of a problem, but actually reading. The torque seal confirmations, the hydraulic system pressure test results, with the technician's name, the date, the calibration certification of the equipment used, the sign-off chain, the subcontractor verification, where applicable, with the dual sign-off that the new process required. She read every page. She was aware that Daniel Brooks, watching from the cockpit, could probably see her through the windscreen. She was aware that Gerald Finn, standing near the hangar entrance, was watching. She didn't perform it for either of them. She just read. When she reached the last page, she closed the folder. She looked out at the airfield, the taxiways, the terminal, the eastern perimeter fence with the highway visible beyond it, the ordinary geography of a working airport on an ordinary May morning. She thought about a Tuesday in October, a hangar at 6:15. A man with a clipboard and a $700 fee, and the patience to look at a hydraulic fitting until he understood exactly what it was telling him. She thought about 4 words. Read page 47 before you fly. She went inside and sat down and buckled her seatbelt, and the aircraft moved toward the runway. And the morning opened ahead of it, and she watched the ground fall away beneath her with the particular attention of someone who had learned, at some cost, not to take the ordinary miracle of it for granted. The valve held. The pressure was correct. The flight was unremarkable in every way. which was, as Ethan Mercer had known for 20 years, exactly what you were working for. The sentencing happened on a gray Tuesday in March, in a federal courthouse downtown that had the particular institutional weight of buildings where serious things had been decided for a long time. The wood paneling was dark, the acoustics were flat, and the fluorescent lighting was the kind that made everyone look slightly unwell, regardless of how they felt going in. Richard Hale sat at the defendant's table in a suit he'd bought for a different life. The kind you bought when your career was ascending and you needed to look like someone who belonged in certain rooms. It still fit. Everything about the physical situation still fit. It was only the interior arrangements that had shifted past recognition. David Park sat beside him, organized and precise, his notes in the same careful order they always were. Richard had, over the preceding months, developed a specific kind of gratitude for David Park that he hadn't expected. Not the grateful feeling of someone being protected, but the grateful feeling of someone being told true things by a person whose job it was to tell them, even when the true things were uncomfortable. David had never softened the picture for him. He had always said exactly what the situation was. Richard had come to understand somewhere in the middle of November that this was the thing he'd needed most and had been least surrounded by in the years before all of this happened. The judge was a woman in her early 60s named Honorable Margaret Foss, who had the look of someone who had heard every version of every story and was not interested in the performance of remorse, but was deeply interested in whether any actual understanding had occurred. She had reviewed the pre-sentencing report, the cooperation documentation from the authorities' investigation, and the statements from both sides. When she addressed Richard directly, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Mr. Hale," she said, "you didn't set out to endanger anyone. I'm willing to accept that as a true statement. What I'm less willing to accept is the proposition that you didn't know what you were doing when you wrote those numbers down." She paused. "Because the evidence suggests you knew exactly what you were doing. You knew the real numbers weren't right. You knew the aircraft had a problem. And you chose to write something different because the honest number would have been professionally uncomfortable." Richard didn't say anything. He'd been told not to speak unless addressed with a direct question, and even if he hadn't been, he wasn't sure what he would have said. She wasn't wrong about any of it. "The consequence of aviation safety failures isn't theoretical," the judge continued. "It isn't paperwork. 9 people were scheduled to board that aircraft. 9 people who trusted that the systems designed to protect them were functioning. The fact that none of them were harmed is not a credit to the choices you made. It is entirely a credit to an independent inspector who did his job correctly and to a pilot who read what that inspector wrote." She looked at him steadily. "The question this court has to answer is, what consequence is proportionate to what you chose to do? And the answer it has arrived at accounts for both the gravity of the choice and for the genuine cooperation you've provided since." The sentence was what David Park had projected. Significant federal fines, 3 years of probation with conditions, permanent revocation of any aviation management or certification authority, and a federal record that would follow him for the remainder of his professional life. No incarceration. Richard stood when the sentence was read and said, "Yes, Your Honor," to the conditions, and signed what he was asked to sign, and walked out of the courthouse into the gray March morning with David Park beside him, and the weight of the sentence already settling into the specific configuration it was going to occupy in his life going forward. Not crushing, but permanent. The kind of thing you carried in a pocket you couldn't empty. "How are you?" David asked on the courthouse steps. Richard thought about it. "I'm okay," he said. "I think I'm actually okay." David studied him for a moment. "Good," he said. He shook Richard's hand. "Call me if anything comes up with the probation conditions. Otherwise," he paused. "Otherwise, I think you're on your own." "I think so too," Richard said. He stood on the steps for a moment after David left. The street in front of the courthouse was doing its ordinary morning thing. Traffic, pedestrians, a delivery truck idling at the curb. The ordinary machinery of a city that had no particular interest in what had just happened in the building behind him and would have continued exactly as it was regardless. He thought about Diane's pasta recipe. He thought about his older daughter's hands on the kitchen counter, watching his. He walked to his car. "Net, The certification authority released its formal final report on the N441VA incident in early April, 6 months after the preliminary findings. It ran to 63 pages and covered the technical sequence, the documentation failures, the organizational conditions that had contributed to the maintenance gap, and the remediation measures Ashford Holdings had undertaken. It also included, in Section 7, a finding that had not appeared in the preliminary report. The finding addressed the role of the independent inspection process in identifying the defect. Specifically, the fact that a pre-departure independent inspection had caught a maintenance failure that 6 weeks of normal operational oversight had missed. The finding noted that the independent inspection had been conducted correctly, thoroughly, and with appropriate documentation, and that the inspector's decision to clearly communicate his finding before leaving the site had been directly responsible for the subsequent ground of the aircraft. The word directly appeared in the finding twice. Aviation regulatory language was not given to superlatives, and directly responsible, in a formal authority finding, meant something specific and weighted. Sylvia Marsh sent Ethan a copy of the final report by email with no accompanying message, which was her way of being collegial without being effusive, which Ethan understood and respected. He read the full report that evening at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd sat in October and read the preliminary notice, with the same mug, different tea, same mug, at the same edge of the table where it always ended up. He read Section 7 twice. He was not, by nature or by habit, someone who needed external confirmation that his work had value. He'd done it long enough to have his own accounting system for that, which did not require anyone else's ledger. But he was also not someone who pretended that recognition was meaningless, because that was a different kind of dishonesty. The performance of indifference by someone who actually cared, which was one of the less attractive things people did to seem a certain way. He cared. He was glad the record was clear. He closed the report and washed his mug and went to bed. Gerald Finn came into the Meridian Terminal at 7:15 every morning, which was earlier than his new role required and earlier than anyone else usually arrived, and he used the first 45 minutes of each day doing the same thing, walking the hangar floor. He didn't inspect the aircraft in any formal sense. That was the technician's work, and the new protocols specified exactly who did what and when and how it was signed off. He just walked. He looked at things. He watched the way the maintenance staff moved through their morning routines, and he listened to what was said and to what wasn't said, and he made mental notes about both. He was not a perfect manager. He had, in the months since his appointment, made 3 decisions he later reconsidered, had one difficult conversation with a technician that he handled less well than he'd wanted to, and had twice let schedule pressure influence the pace at which documentation reviews were completed. He caught himself both times and went back and completed them properly, but the catching himself was the point. It required active attention, the way keeping a car in its lane on a long straight highway required active attention, even though the road offered no obvious obstacles. The drift was constant. The correction was constant. He had talked to Ethan about this in one of their monthly conversations, sitting in the small office Gerald had inherited from Richard and had spent 2 weeks trying to make feel less like Richard's by rearranging the furniture and adding a whiteboard and removing the collection of model aircraft that had lined the windowsill. "Does it get easier?" Gerald had asked. The constant correction. Ethan had thought about it with the unhurried quality he brought to questions he was taking seriously. "No," he said, "but you get faster at recognizing when you've drifted. And that's most of the job, honestly. Not drifting, just noticing quickly and coming back." "That's not very encouraging," Gerald said. "No," Ethan said, "but it's what it is." Gerald had thought about that conversation on many of the mornings since. It had the quality of useful truth, the kind that didn't make the situation easier but made the situation clearer, and clarity was something you could work with. Carlos Rodriguez's formal statement to the certification authority and his account of raising the valve concern with Richard and being overridden had been referenced twice in the authority's final report, once in the sequence of events section and once in the organizational culture analysis. It was accurate both times. Carlos was identified in the report by role rather than name, which was the authority's standard practice for individuals who were witnesses rather than subjects. He read those sections of the report when it was released. He read them carefully, the way he read technical documentation, looking for precision, checking for accuracy. The report was accurate. He hadn't expected it to be anything else, but reading it confirmed something he'd been working toward for 6 months. The ability to see the sequence clearly without it being primarily a story about his own failure. He had failed, at a specific moment, to push hard enough through the right channel. The channel hadn't existed in any real form. Both things were true and neither one erased the other. He had started, 3 months into the new reporting process, using the anonymous channel twice, not for major concerns, but for the kind of small things he would previously have let go. A documentation entry that seemed to be missing a secondary sign-off, a subcontractor timeline that seemed unrealistically short for the work being described. Both times the report was reviewed within 48 hours. Both times Gerald followed up with him directly, not to identify him as the source, because the channel was genuinely anonymous and Gerald said he didn't know who had filed, but to let the maintenance team know the concern had been reviewed and what the outcome was. Both times the concern had been minor, and the outcome was documentation correction and no further action. But the process had worked. The concern had been filed, reviewed, and resolved without anyone losing their job or their professional standing or their relationship with their supervisor. That was the thing that was supposed to happen. For the first time in Carlos's 9 years at Meridian, it had happened. He told Hatch about this on a Tuesday evening in April, standing on the back porch while the dog moved through the grass in his slow, investigative way. Hatch was 12 and a half and had developed a slight arthritis in his rear hips that the vet had prescribed anti-inflammatories for, and he moved with the careful dignity of an old animal who was not yet willing to concede to the indignity of slowing down. Carlos was aware that telling his dog about workplace regulatory improvements was not a normal thing. He was also aware that Hatch was not going to tell anyone, and that the back porch on a spring evening was one of the better places to say true things out loud to an audience that wasn't going to complicate them. "It's better," he told Hatch. "It's not fixed, but it's better." Hatch raised his head, wagged once, went back to the grass. Carlos took that for what it was worth. In late April, 3 weeks before Ethan's consultancy engagement was formally scheduled to conclude, Victoria Ashford called him at 9 in the morning on a day he was between inspections, driving the stretch of highway between Harlow Regional and the county airport with the windows down because the morning was the kind of morning that the windows down option seemed invented for. He answered through the truck's speaker. "I have something I want to show you," she said. "Can you come to the terminal this afternoon?" "I can do 4 o'clock, he said. 4 o'clock? She confirmed. He arrived to find her in the hangar rather than the terminal, which was unusual. She was standing near the maintenance board that Gerald had installed along the west wall of the hangar 3 months into the new process. A large physical board that tracked every aircraft in Meridian's fleet, its current maintenance status, its next scheduled service, and any open items. Each open item had a card with the technician's name, the date it was flagged, and the current status. The board was not digital. This had been a deliberate choice, and it had been Ethan's suggestion, not because he distrusted digital systems, but because a physical board in the middle of a shared space made maintenance status visible to everyone who walked through the hangar. It normalized the idea that open items were not embarrassments to be resolved privately, but ordinary parts of a working maintenance process. Victoria was looking at the board when he walked in. 3 open items on N441VA, she said, without turning. Hydraulic fluid level in the auxiliary system is at the low end of normal. A seal on the number 2 engine access panel latch needs replacement, and the co-pilot's navigation display is showing an intermittent calibration flag. All documented? He asked. All documented. Each one flagged by the technician on the same day it was identified. Reviewed by Gerald within 24 hours. Parts on order for the engine panel seal. Navigation display booked for avionics review next week. Hydraulic level being monitored daily until the source of the slow loss is identified. She turned. The aircraft isn't scheduled to fly until the hydraulic issue is resolved. He looked at the board, at the 3 cards, each with a name and a date and a status. That's how it's supposed to work, he said. Yes, she said. I know. A pause. I wanted you to see it. He understood what she was showing him, not the board itself, but what the board represented. A hangar culture in which a technician flagged a hydraulic fluid level at the low end of normal, wrote it on a card, put the card on the board, and the result was the aircraft sitting until the issue was understood. No one had minimized it. No one had argued it was close enough. No one had written a number that made the low end look like the middle. The thing that had nearly killed 9 people in October, described at its most mechanical level, was a system in which the wrong numbers were written down because the right numbers were inconvenient. The board on the wall was a system in which the right numbers were written down regardless. It was not complicated. It had just not existed. Gerald's idea? Ethan asked. Gerald and Carlos Rodriguez, actually, she said. Carlos suggested the physical format, said digital was too easy to look at without seeing. She paused. I think he's right. Ethan looked at the board for another moment. Then he looked at her. You're in good hands, he said. Something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically, just the slight softening of someone who had been working very hard at something and had just heard, from a credible source, that the work was going somewhere real. I'm in better hands than I was in October, she said. I'm not sure good is a permanent condition. No, he said. It's not. It's a practice. She looked at him. Is everything a practice with you? Most things worth doing, he said. She almost laughed. It was the first time he'd seen anything close to laughter from her, and it suited her. Brief, genuine, without performance. That's either very wise or very frustrating, depending on the day. Both, he said. Usually both. Ethan's final formal report for the engagement was submitted to Ashford Holdings on a Friday in late April. 89 pages covering 6 months of documented change, gap analysis, remediation tracking, and forward recommendations. He wrote the summary section last because summary sections required knowing what the whole thing added up to, and that wasn't always clear until the work was done. He wrote the summary at his kitchen table on a Thursday evening, with the bad habit he'd never broken of working in poor light when the overhead was too harsh, and a cup of tea going cold at the edge of the table, the way cups of tea always did. He wrote, the organization that existed in October had the physical infrastructure and the professional expertise to conduct safe aviation operations. What it lacked was a culture in which the expertise was consistently applied and in which the people doing the work felt that applying it fully, even when it was slow, even when it was inconvenient, even when it created friction, was both expected and protected. The gap between having expertise and consistently applying it is not a technical problem. It is a human problem, and it is solved by human means, by leadership that models the behavior it requires, by systems that protect people who raise concerns, and by the long, slow work of demonstrating, through repeated actual instances, that the right thing to do is also the safe thing to do professionally. He read it back. He added one sentence. This work is never finished. It is only maintained or abandoned, and the difference between those two outcomes is visible in the documentation. He submitted the report at 8:15 Friday morning while he was driving to his 9 o'clock inspection. Victoria called him at 10, between his 9 o'clock and an 11:30. The summary section, she said. Yes. The last sentence. A pause. I'm going to put it on the maintenance board. He thought about that. Gerald might have thoughts about what goes on the maintenance board. Gerald already saw it, she said. He said it was the most concise maintenance philosophy he'd read in 20 years, and that you can put it on the board. Ethan was quiet for a moment, driving with the windows down, the May morning doing what May mornings occasionally did if they felt like it, warm and clear, and without any of the complications that weather usually brought. All right, he said. That. The sentence went on the board the following Monday, printed on a strip of laminated cardstock, and affixed to the upper right corner where every technician, every pilot, every manager, and every outside visitor who walked through the hangar would see it. This work is never finished. It is only maintained or abandoned, and the difference between those two outcomes is visible in the documentation. Gerald Finn read it every morning when he did his walk. He didn't find it reassuring. It wasn't designed to reassure. It was designed to remind, which was a different thing, and a thing that required daily application rather than periodic acknowledgement. Carlos Rodriguez read it too, on his way past the board to the tool locker each morning. He had come to think of it, without saying so to anyone, as a description of most of the things that mattered. Not just maintenance work, not just aviation safety, but the specific human challenge of doing the right thing consistently in the face of the constant pressure that the world exerted toward doing the easier thing. The pressure never went away. You just kept going anyway, or you didn't. He had, in the months since October, chosen to keep going. Not heroically, not dramatically, just with the daily, somewhat unglamorous decision to write down what he actually saw instead of what was convenient to see. It was not a transformation story. He hadn't been transformed. He was the same person who had looked at a valve fitting in September and mentioned it once to the wrong person and let it go. He was the same person who had driven home that Tuesday evening last October and sat at his kitchen table with a warm beer and the weight of what might have been. He was just also the person who had told the truth to the Certification Authority investigators, who had filed 2 anonymous reports, who had suggested a physical board to Gerald and explained why the format mattered. He was the same person doing things slightly differently, which was not transformation, but was not nothing. Ethan Mercer turned 45 in June, which he celebrated by doing nothing in particular. His sister called from Portland and talked for 40 minutes about her kids, whom he saw twice a year and liked more with each visit as they aged out of the phase he found most difficult, the very small years when children were essentially unknowable, and into the years when they had opinions and wanted to argue about things. He told her he'd come up in August. She said she'd hold him to it. He had dinner by himself at a Thai place he went to occasionally, ate too much curry, and drove home in the blue early dark of a June evening. He thought about the year. He thought about the thing he'd told Victoria. The crisis creates the will. The test is whether the will survives the normality that follows, and about whether it applied to himself as much as it applied to organizations. He had spent 6 months doing work that was larger in scope and more visible in consequence than his usual day-to-day. And now the engagement was concluded and the day-to-day was returning with its ordinary texture. The turboprops and the Cessnas and the King Airs and the occasional Gulfstream. The FBOs and the hangars and the guys in coveralls and the owner-operators who made conversation while he worked. He had liked the consultancy work. He wasn't sure he'd understood how much he liked it until it was done and he could assess it in retrospect, the way you sometimes couldn't tell how warm a room was until you'd stepped outside. He had liked talking to Gerald every month. He had liked the documentation audit in a way that would have been difficult to explain to most people, because what he'd liked about it was the same thing he liked about the walk-around on an aircraft. The close attention, the willingness to look at the thing until you understood it rather than until you'd confirmed it was what you expected. He had liked the conversation in the hangar with Victoria, looking at the maintenance board. He was not going to pretend to himself that the money hadn't been significant, because it had been, and pretending otherwise was the kind of false modesty he found irritating in other people and tried not to practice himself. The renewed 12-month arrangement would continue to be significant. It had changed in a practical way what the next few years of his working life looked like. But the money was not the reason he'd said yes to either arrangement. The reason he'd said yes was that the work mattered and the people doing it were, as best he could tell, genuinely trying to do it right, and he was in a position to help. That was sufficient. He had learned in the 20 years of his working life that sufficient was underrated. People spent a great deal of energy pursuing more than sufficient, which was sometimes right and sometimes the thing that drove them past the work that was actually theirs to do and into work that belonged to someone else's ambition. Sufficient when it was real, when it was the result of doing exactly the right thing in exactly the right place, was not a consolation. It was the whole point. He drove home and went to bed and didn't lie awake. No time. In September, 11 months after the morning that had changed the shape of everyone's year, Daniel Brooks flew N441VA to a private terminal in San Francisco, carrying Victoria Ashford and 3 board members for a 2-day strategy meeting. The flight was 87 minutes. The weather was cooperative. The aircraft performed exactly as it was designed to perform. Before the flight, at the San Francisco terminal, one of the board members, the private equity man whose name was Jonathan Reeves, who had asked the wrong question at the October board meeting and had been learning from it ever since in the quiet way that some people learned from being corrected by someone they respected, stood near the departure gate watching Daniel Brooks complete his pre-flight walkthrough on the ramp below. "Does he do that every time?" Jonathan said. Victoria was standing beside him with her boarding folder in her hand. "Yes," she said. "Every flight?" "Every flight," she said. "That's the walk-around. It's part of the protocol. You check everything externally before you get in the airplane, even if the aircraft was inspected 6 hours ago." Jonathan watched Daniel crouch near the landing gear, checking something with careful attention. "And you trust that?" Jonathan said. "That what he sees is accurate?" Victoria said. "Yes, I trust that." "How?" She opened her folder. She turned to the maintenance documentation section and held it out to him. "Because I read this," she said. "All of it. And because the person who signed off every entry in there understands that the signature means what it says." She paused. "And because if someone sees something in that aircraft that doesn't look right, there is now a place to put that concern that doesn't cost them anything to use." Jonathan looked at the folder. He looked at Daniel Brooks completing his walkthrough on the ramp below. "How did it work before us?" he said. It wasn't an aggressive question. He was genuinely asking. Victoria thought about how to answer that. She thought about the specific morning in October, the hangar at 6:15, the gleam of the aircraft, the check for $700 handed over without looking up, the report placed on a table and an inspector who said 4 words and walked out. "Before," she said, "it worked right up until it didn't, and we mistook the absence of a failure for evidence that the system was sound." Jonathan was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant thing to have been wrong about," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She closed the folder. Below, Daniel Brooks finished the walk-around and climbed the air stairs. Victoria watched him go, then looked down at the maintenance documentation in her hand. She thought about the maintenance board in the hangar at Harlow, with its 3 open items on N441VA in April, and the laminated card in the upper right corner, and the sentence that Gerald read every morning. She thought about Ethan Mercer in a parking lot in October, sitting in his truck with bad coffee, having done his job completely and correctly, and without any particular expectation of acknowledgement, about to drive to his next inspection. She thought about what it cost to do the right thing in the small moments, the unglamorous moments, when no one was watching and the easier thing was right there. The answer was sometimes nothing. Sometimes the small discomfort of slowing down when everything around you wanted you to go faster. Sometimes the professional friction of being the person who said, "Wait," in a room full of people who didn't want to hear it. And occasionally, not often, but occasionally, it cost more than that. It cost a certification and a career and 3 years of probation and the specific kind of reckoning that came from knowing you had written numbers down that weren't real and that 9 people had almost paid for it with something that couldn't be returned. The distribution was not fair. Most people who cut corners didn't face the version that cost the most. The cost came randomly, the way structural failures came, not reliably correlated with the severity of the corner, just with the specific accumulated circumstances of that particular day, that particular fitting, that particular inspector who happened to look long enough. Which was, Victoria had come to understand, precisely the argument for not cutting corners at all. Not because you would always be caught, you probably wouldn't, but because the system that kept people alive wasn't built from the large dramatic decisions. It was built from the small, ordinary ones. The torque seal applied every time, the documentation completed fully, the concern written down and filed, the report read all the way to page 47. It was built from the patience of a 44-year-old man in a hangar at 6:15 in the morning, looking at a hydraulic fitting until he understood exactly what it was telling him. She boarded the aircraft. She sat down and buckled her seatbelt and opened her laptop to the materials for tomorrow's strategy meeting, and the aircraft moved toward the runway with the ordinary, purposeful heaviness of a machine doing what it was built to do. She worked for about 20 minutes as the aircraft climbed to cruise altitude. Then she stopped working and looked out the window at the ground below, the patchwork of it, the ordinary geography of the world at distance. And she thought about something Ethan had said in one of their earliest conversations back in November when she'd asked him how he'd ended up doing this particular work. He'd thought about it for a moment in the way he thought about things he was taking seriously, and he'd said, "My instructor used to say that the aircraft will tell you what's wrong if you're willing to listen. Most people aren't patient enough to listen." She'd asked him what that meant, practically. "It means slowing down enough to see what's actually there," he said, "not what you expect to be there. Not what would be convenient to find. What's actually there?" She'd thought about that in the months since. She'd thought about it in board meetings and in documentation reviews and in the middle of conversations where the pressure to move faster was a physical presence in the room. She'd thought about it standing in the hangar looking at the maintenance board. She thought about it now, 39,000 feet above the ordinary world, on an aircraft whose valve held and whose documentation was correct and whose pilot had done his walk-around with the careful attention of someone who understood that the walk-around mattered even when, especially when, nothing had gone wrong yet, slowing down enough to see what was actually there. It was not, she understood now, a natural gift. It was not the effortless talent of certain exceptional people. It was a practice, exactly as Ethan had said. The daily, unglamorous decision to look at the thing in front of you with full attention instead of the portion of attention you had left over after everything else made its demands. Most people had the attention. Most people were capable of the patience. What most people lacked was the conviction that it was worth it, the deep, settled belief that the thing you were looking at deserved your full presence even when it was inconvenient, even when nothing had gone wrong yet, even when every system and every schedule was pressing you to move faster and assume the thing you hadn't checked was probably fine. It was almost never not fine. That was the honest truth of it. Almost never was not the same as never. And the almost was where everything that mattered lived. The aircraft flew on. Victoria closed her laptop, looked out the window one more time at the particular quality of light at cruise altitude, the way the sky above was a shade of blue you couldn't find at sea level, the way the horizon curved almost imperceptibly if you knew to look for it. She looked for it. Below her, at Harlow Regional Airport, the maintenance board in the Meridian hangar carried its open items and its daily status cards, and its laminated sentence in the upper right corner. Gerald Finn had done his morning walk. Carlos Rodriguez had done his pre-shift check. The documentation was current and complete and visible to anyone who walked through. And somewhere on the east side of Harlow, in an office above a storage facility, a 45-year-old aircraft inspector was sitting at his desk with a completed report and a cup of something that had probably gone cold, filing the paperwork from his 9 o'clock inspection and thinking about his next one. Not because someone was watching, not because the record required it, because that was the job, done the way the job was supposed to be done. Quietly, completely, with the patient attention of someone who understood that the difference between what was fine and what was almost fine was sometimes 4 degrees and a $2 torque seal and the willingness to slow down long enough to see it. The valve held. The pressure was correct. The sky was that shade of blue you couldn't find at sea level. And the small things carried exactly as much as they always had.